Okay, so we are live and we've got a very interesting show today. It's actually the start of a new series called Radicals, and it's where the Israel advocacy movement invites radical Jewish thinkers who support the existence of Jews in Israel, but maybe don't have the most conventional views when it comes to how the state of Israel should look today, or how a Jewish state should look, or whether there should be a Jewish state on the land. And our first guest in this series is Gabriel. Now, Gabriel is a Talmud, a very well known, but I'd say slightly alternative in terms of normative Orthodox Judaism, a slightly alternative rabbi called Rabbi David Bar Haim. Or David. So one of the interesting things about this rabbi is that he wants to pronounce Hebrew, or he wants to encourage the pronunciation of Hebrew in a more traditional way rather than the more modern way that it's pronounced today. So maybe a good way to start, Gabriel, is what would the correct pronunciation of your rabbi's name be?
As best as I can do it, it would be David Bar Haim.
Perfect. Thank you.
Although my resh there was not good. One of the things I've not been very successful is converting my very flat English R into a traditional Hebrew R. I can do it, but I have to make an effort.
One of the things that's quite interesting, because I daven with Adanim, actually, not Temanim. And it's interesting listening because he still keeps the Ashkenaz melodies that you will pray to, but with a more traditional, almost Yemenite sounding at times pronunciation. But anyway, we deviate. That's not why we're here today. We're not here to talk Hebrew because I'm not qualified to. But what I would like to do is, so you're on the show as a reactionary. So Gabriel, I'll hand the mic over to you. Can you explain to me and my audience what you meant when you described yourself as a Jewish reactionary? What are you reacting to? What is a reactionary?
Okay, so I use the term reactionary because I think it describes quite well both my religious and my political views, which I try to the best of my abilities to keep consistent. And let's put it this way. So conservatism as a concept, as a movement, more or less goes back to Edmund Burke. You can find things before that, antecessors, but Edmund Burke is a reasonable place to start off. And Edmund Burke's conception of conservatism is basically, look, we're living in 18th century England. Obviously, 18th century England is not the same as Anglo-Saxon England or Stuart England or Plantagenet England. So things have obviously changed. But the change that's happening right now is not a good kind of change. It's an inorganic kind of change. For some reason, it's different to previous eras of historical change, and we should just kind of stop changing. That's a caricature, obviously, of Burke, and it's a caricature of conservatism in general. But all caricatures, they're caricatures because they preserve an element of the truth. And a progressive would say, well, no, history's always been changing, so let's go and change it some more. So a reactionary comes in and says, well, wait a second. You've got one side who says everything's been getting better and better and better, but now we just need to stop. And another side that says everything's getting better and better and better, and let's push forward. And a reactionary says, well, stop a second. How do you know? Maybe things have got worse. And the basic position of reactionary is that all of history is equal. That the present has no, the present is one voice, but it has no primary status over the past, and no particular point in the past also has primary status. So this is the pure reactionary position. I'm not saying that this is my reactionary position. I'm saying the pure reactionary position is every single historical culture, era, person has a voice at the table, and let's hammer it out and see who's correct. And so a Jewish reactionary is someone who says, and this is, I believe, again, this is my own personal opinion. I should be clear, I don't represent Machon Shiloh or anything like that. And anyone who finds my views repulsive or idiotic shouldn't, for that reason, discount Machon Shiloh. But I do believe a big part of Machon Shiloh is, whereas orthodoxy is essentially conservative. It says, look, Judaism's obviously changed. Obviously, it's not the same in the Gaonic period. It's not the same in the Rishonic period. It's not the same in the Achronic period. But we've reached a point, and now we just can't change anything ever again. Now, some things do change, but the official position, at least, really is We're never going to change. We've hit perfect maximum point. Now, of course, we're not perfect because actually we're vastly inferior to previous generations. But we can't do what previous generations did because we can't change anything anymore. That's the kind of orthodox conservative position. Obviously, unfortunately, there's this other heterodox denomination called conservative that confuses the terminology. But that's what it was called in Jewish terms. That's called the orthodox position, and it parallels quite strongly to the wider conservative position. And obviously, you have more moderate and more extreme conservatives. So you have modern Orthodox versus Haredi. And Machon Shiloh, or the concept of Torath Eretz Yisrael, or Toras Eretz Yisrael, however you prefer to pronounce it, I'm easy. I actually still, if I'm being lazy, I most easily lapse into Ashkenazi pronunciation. Is a big part of it is saying the mere fact that we do something this way now does not give it a casting vote. It doesn't mean we throw everything out right away, but it means that the kind of this assumption that if you look in the Rambam and you see the Rambam says to do this, and the Ramban says to do this, and the Raavad says to do this, and this all seems very reasonable, but it differs from what we do today. Well, it's just too bad. A very large part of what Machon Shiloh is all about is saying, well, so what? Basically, we want to fulfill the Torah in the best way possible. We want to worship Hashem in the best way possible. We want to, in all our actions, fulfill the intention and the letter of the Torah, and therefore we're going to do it. And that I would characterize as a reactionary position. It's parallel to the reactionary position more general. And then the second reason I use the term reactionary is because the non-Jewish thinkers of 2021, Leminyanam, who I'm most interested in reading, as a rule describe themselves as reactionaries.
It's quite interesting because I've got a conversation tomorrow, not on this channel, elsewhere, not tomorrow, 2 days' time, with a neo-reactionary, and I always associate them as being very to the right, but I'm told not racist, not ethno-nationalist, but I'm going to find out because I'm talking to
them. Wait. First of all, who is it?
I'm not going to say on this channel, but I'll tell you offline.
Okay, fine. All right. Okay, let's put it this way. Not racist is a point of principle.
Not racist, is it? Say that again?
Racism isn't a big focus of being a neo-reactionary.
But it's
not central to your identity. Well, I mean, I think the standard neo-reactionary position, and I also believe it myself, is that the term racism. Well, okay, listen. Simple question. What's the Hebrew word for racism?
You tell me.
Well, it's gizanut, where geza gimel zayin ayin is a tree trunk, and so therefore, by extension, it means a human trunk, i.e., a race, and therefore, someone who's interested in race is a gizan. So, if you're in Israel and you object to the fact that someone leaves their rubbish bag kind of in the street instead of throwing it in a bin, and you take it out with them, they're quite likely to call you a gizan. This is a thing that happens quite a lot here. But anyway, the point is so the question is the Hebrew term for racism is gizanut, and a racist is a gizan. Now, where do you find in rabbinic literature the term gizanut or gizan?
So again, the floor's yours.
Well, obviously you don't. Okay, and for the same reason that if you try and search literature, I don't remember the exact year. People who are more dedicated to racism than me will be able to tell you. I think it's 1913, something like that, the first recorded mention of the term racist. So the point is, if this concept doesn't exist inside your tradition, therefore it's irrelevant to you. So, the term racist or racism contains a huge number of factual claims, some of which are completely false and some of which are true, and a huge number of ethical claims, some of which are very wrong and immoral, and some of which are moral. But the mere fact that something is racist to, I think, well, first of all, I believe to a sincere Jew, but also to any kind of neo-reactionary, is just completely irrelevant. It's many things that are racist are wrong, but the mere fact that something is racist, or you call something is racist, or 2021, we decided that this is racist. You know, there's a famous song. I'm sure you've seen it on YouTube. Everything is racist. Bananas are racist. You know, go Google on YouTube after you're finished. Everything is racist. I think it was made like 2016 already, but everything is racist in 2016. Anyway, doesn't matter. The point is obviously the concept of race. You know, what is racist and what isn't racist keeps evolving. But the reactionary or the neo-reactionary position is, okay, I want to talk about whether this is true or false. I want to talk about whether this is moral or immoral. And you slapping some modern name from a belief system that I don't subscribe to is irrelevant. Just like if I'm talking to a Muslim and he says, what's the Muslim word for kafira? It's not haram. They have kufar and they have, what's the Muslim word for heresy?
Kafira. It's kafir. Kafir
okay,
is a
kafir.
heretic.
Fine.
Yeah.
All right. So I talk to a Muslim. He tells me something is kafir. Okay, you may be true. According to your belief system, I don't know. I'm not a scholar of Islam. And it may well be what. But I mean, why would you possibly expect me to care whether something is kafir or not? I don't subscribe to your ethical belief system. And racism is a concept within an ethical belief system that I don't subscribe to. Now, obviously, that's very different from what we might call a racist or an ethno-nationalist or whatever who says, you know, my belief system is racism. You know, I believe that, you know, the most important job of any person is to bolster the interest of their race, blah, 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 whatever. Okay. Those, you know, that's a positive belief in racism. A big part of being a reactionary is being a nihilist about modern values. It's to say, I live in a culture. This culture has a prevailing belief system. That's fine. Every culture has a prevailing belief system, but it's not my prevailing belief system. And the mere fact that something is or isn't, you know, it could be racist, it could be kafir, it could be blom, blom, blom. It really doesn't matter. It's not relevant to me. So that's the neo-reactionary position on racism. But I mean, perhaps your chap who you're going to talk to, did you say tomorrow or the next day? Perhaps he'll be able to give you 2 days. Perhaps he'll be able to give you a better explanation. 1 second.
Amen. So it's definitely not the rabbit hole I want to go down. There's many channels that discuss racism. We're staunchly opposed to prejudice of people based on their physical characteristics on this channel and this organization. That's a given for most people today. One of the things that interested me with what you said there, though, was the concept, the term racism doesn't exist within our tradition. Now, there are definitely expressions of racism within our tradition, even if that word doesn't exist. I'm sure you've read the same things that I've read, where medieval rabbis will say something that to modern sensitivities wouldn't be acceptable. And that's fine. But the thing that really interested me with what you said was that the label itself doesn't belong to your tradition, but the label that you've then applied to yourself also doesn't belong to our tradition. There is no biblical Hebrew word for the political concept of a reactionary. And I would imagine in most of the generations up until recently, the orthodox conservative position, small c conservative position, is actually more in keeping with what our ancestors have done throughout the generations. Now, there's been innovations within those traditions, and I completely agree. An Orthodox Haredi rabbi today has a little in practice and appearance to a Talmud Chacham from many years ago, from the Gaonic period or before. So there's little in comparison between the two. There's definitely been an evolution. But that evolution has been one that's born out of trying to conserve rather than innovate in most instances.
It's absolutely and completely true that Judaism, normative, prevalent Judaism, the main trunk, the Gezer, if you will, of Judaism that has endured and become onto this day, while other movements like Karaism or Sadduceeism have burned themselves out, more or less. I mean, there are a few thousand Karaites somewhere, but more or less you can say that burned itself out. It's definitely true that movement can accurately be described as being conservative in terms of giving present practice a very large degree of a casting vote. That's definitely true. And there's been a lot of writing about, the concept of minhag and stuff, which is a way of theorizing this tendency, this attitude. And that's definitely true. And I'd even go further to say that if you're living in conditions where you have Jews living in Poland and Turkey and Spain, and all of them are relatively small groups of people, it takes a long time for them to communicate with each other. None of them have access to centralized political power, at least most of the time they don't. I would say that conservatism is a very good survival strategy, to use a term made famous by a particular internet anti-Semite, a group evolutionary strategy. I'd say it works quite well, very well in fact, and it's responsible for the survival of Judaism. And you could, if you just simply look how different Ashkenazi Judaism is from, say, Kurdish Judaism, and then imagine if these communities had not been conservative, they would have been, tens of times more different, so different it would be hard for them to even relate to each other or come together in any kind of national way at all. But by the same token, I think I can say this is kind of the official Macon Shula position now, when you're back in Eretz Yisrael and you're reuniting as a nation, the same techniques and strategies that were appropriate for surviving in Galut, which remember, and then this is basic, everyone agrees with this is basic to Jewish theology. Obviously, I know heterodox groups don't believe this, but basic to Jewish theology is the concept that Galut is a punishment. And a punishment means if you hadn't have been bad, it wouldn't have happened. So it's an unnatural situation. It's something that should never have been. The techniques and tactics that you use to not die out, basically, under these conditions are not the same as the techniques and tactics when you're building a Jewish society. And, those of us who subscribe to historical Judaism also believe that we're supposed to have a Bet HaMikdash, that we're supposed to have a monarchy, we're supposed to have a Sanhedrin, we're supposed to have all sorts of institutions that simply cannot come into being through this kind of conservative strategy. And by the way, everyone agrees that they can't come into being via this conservative strategy, because if you ask a traditional Orthodox Jew, say, well, where's Beis HaMikdash going to come from? They say, well, it will fall from the sky. If we all daven hard enough and we all shake the lulav with enough kavanah, etc., eventually we rack up enough points and the Beis HaMikdash will fall from the sky. And by the way, I think that for people who genuinely believe that, I think it's a belief that's perfectly compatible with leading a psychologically healthy and spiritually healthy life. However, I also believe that most modern Orthodox people do not, in fact, believe this. Whether or not they profess to believe it is one thing, and whether they believe it in their heart of hearts is another thing. I do not believe that the median Orthodox Jew actually believes that the temple falling from the sky is something that could ever possibly happen. So therefore, when he prays 3 times a day for a Bet HaMikdash and for a king, and by the way, more if he says he eats some bread and he says Birkat HaMazon, it's going to be a lot more than 3 times a day. When he prays for all these things, and he has no intention of doing anything to actually bring them about, and he also doesn't believe they're going to be brought about through magical ends, I believe that that's actually not compatible with a spiritually healthy life. And to a certain extent, I'm not even sure it's compatible with a psychologically healthy life. So a big part of our concept of Torat Eretz Yisrael is that conservatism was a very good thing when it was appropriate, and conservatism is not a good thing when it's inappropriate. And right now, when we clearly have an opportunity to fulfill all sorts of aspects of the Torah that we have not been able to fulfill for thousands of years, this is not the right approach. And the fact that by taking a reactionary approach, you can also, at the same time, modify all sorts of practices that frankly don't make a great deal of sense, is just a really an added benefit as far as I'm concerned.
It's really interesting what you say. And I think one of the things I find particularly interesting, and to explain it to the audience that aren't maybe of a Jewish tradition or a more observant tradition, Within each Jewish community around the world, we have traditions which have evolved throughout the centuries. So on the festival of Passover, some Jews will refrain from certain types of food as they believe they're forbidden, or rulings were put in place that made them forbidden. Whereas to other Jews, those very same foods, so like beans, legumes, are completely permissible. And so what you have here is one community is saying that this is forbidden, and the other is saying it's permitted. And throughout the generations, those traditions have been kept and held, and that's how Jews have been able to retain for centuries and centuries and centuries, living amongst other nations. They've been able to retain these practices because they cleaved to the practices of their fathers. And so if rules were put in place for one community, those communities, they preserved them, whether it's taking multiple wives, you're not allowed to do that anymore amongst Ashkenazim, whether it's refraining from legumes on Passover. There are many different edicts that were said, and that's kept the Jewish people a people. But when we return back to the land, that's where it becomes really interesting for me, is those very same rules that kept us a people now stop us from being a people. Because come the festival of Passover, well, this Jew can't eat in this Jew's house, and suddenly we're not united and there's division. Whereas when that Jew was living in Egypt and the other Jew was living in Krakow in Poland, it didn't make a difference because they didn't need to eat each other's houses on Passover. And so for me, what you're saying is really interesting, and it kind of leads into one of the questions that I put it to you. And actually, maybe with your permission, I'm going to share the post which attracted. I'll just tell you. So I came across Gabrielle. I've never done this before. When we invite guests onto the show, they've usually got a huge or a big YouTube channel. They have a following. This is what they did. It's not what happened here. I saw Gabrielle commenting, clicked on his Facebook page, and his post actually caught my eye. I'd never seen anybody speaking in this way. Yet I knew, or I assumed, that he was based in Israel and potentially living over the Green Line, certainly going over the Green Line, and probably not having any issue with Jews living over the Green Line. Maybe we'll get into that. I'm not sure. And what I'll do, I'll just share the very first one of the posts that caught my eye, and then we'll go into that post, and we'll go into more than that post, your view on a Jewish state. So I'll begin with the post. Let me just share the screen. So you should now be seeing my screen. Yep, I can see that we are. Let me just. Okay, so a lot of people are noticing that the Zionist regime is doing crazed, out of control, evil things, like forcing people out of their jobs for not getting a vaccine. So we're already not demonetized now on YouTube because we said the V word. That doesn't work, and they wouldn't need it if I did. And they wouldn't need it if it did. Or making little children wear muzzles that don't work, impede child development, and would be actively harmful if they did work, because building up immunity to endemic viruses as a child is how your immune system works. Where they get stuck, though, is imagining that some evil spirit or foreign conspiracy has taken over their once amazing country. Now, this isn't going to be a COVID conversation. It's not the shtick of it. Whatever you believe, that's your business. I'm not going to get involved in anyone's views on vaccinations and whatnot. What I want to focus on is the thing that you now go into. To use the technical term, this is cope. Structures don't fall down like this unless they are already rotten. Or how do you remove the scales from your eyes? Actually, it's easy. Go to Ramat Gan. Stand pretty much anywhere. Close your eyes. Take a deep breath. Purge your mind of everything you have heard about Startup Nation and Global Tech Center and whatever. Now open your eyes and look. What do you see? What do you actually see? Your bones are telling you what you see, but you don't want to believe it. Your bones are right. You see evil. And you've attached a picture to help the viewer or the reader visualize what it is that you're describing as evil. So I'm going to bring us back in, and so that post was jarring, because when I look at Israel, I don't see Israel evil. I see when I look at those buildings, I see a miracle. I see something that my ancestors dreamed of, and our generation, and the generations before, in just over 70 years, have built up an incredible nation. And for me, that's purely good. That's pure. And I'm not saying all Jews are pure and this is the thing, but it's the opposite of what I would describe as evil. It's good. It's incredible. And so my question to you is, if this is evil, first I'll let you explain that, because you described that, you explained to me beforehand, it was a bit of a rant, maybe a little bit of personal therapy, just getting something off your chest. That's what we use Facebook for. It was never intended for my channel or my audience, and so I'll certainly let you explain. But a Jewish state in general, clearly you are very critical of the current government and maybe all the previous governments. And so I just wanted to understand from your perspective, what is the opposite of what you see today?
Okay, so, well, okay, you said a lot of things. So what part would you like me to answer first?
Let's begin with what a Jewish state should look like today. What your Jewish state should look like today.
Okay, right. Okay, that's a fair question. What should a Jewish state look like today? So, I think that a Jewish state today should look like as follows. It should have a Beth HaMikdash as the national religious center of the Jewish people. It should have a Sanhedrin as the judicial and legal center of the Jewish people. It should have a king from the house of David, from Beth David, leading the nation. And that's just kind of, that, to be honest, is kind of basic kind of post-Kahanism. You can find like not a million, but you can find hundreds of people on the internet, and they tend to spend quite a lot of time on the internet, who will tell you that. But by the way, I don't, I said it, and that's what I believe. But I also believe that a Jewish state should be based upon an organic connection between people and a land. That organic connection cannot be merely abstract at the state and national level. It should be at the individual, the family, the town, and even at the tribal level. I'm not saying we should, or it's even possible to reorganize ourselves into the 12 Shvatim again and become Zevulun and Yissachar, etc. But what I do believe is that people should be specifically connected to a part of Eretz Yisrael that is physically connected to them, that their parents lived on, that they have reasonable expectation that their children will live on, and that their existence is bound up with the health and I'll use the word health. I don't think there's another better word, with the health of the land. In contrast, and this is the case with the vast majority of contemporary Israeli architecture, instead of, and I use this word advisedly and deliberately, instead of making war on the soil to stick a modern technological capitalist Western culture and means of production upon it, that we should be connected to the land in a way that our lives are bound up with the health of that land. That to see a part of Eretz Yisrael that is by nature beautiful, that could be a thriving field, or could be a house built in the traditional style appropriate to the region, and to find a piece of generic international architecture tat plunked on top of it, and is something that I think should make anyone who claims to love the land of Israel at least pause for thought, but actually feel quite upset. And there's a famous story. It's about the Chofetz Chaim, who, for the benefit of those who don't know, was a very famous and very great Rav around the turn of the 20th century, a major leader of Haredi Judaism, the author of the Mishnah Berurah, which is a very widely used code, as well as many books on ethics, one of which is called the Chofetz Chaim, from which he takes his name. And he came from a traditional Jewish town, and one Shabbos, he saw someone breaking Shabbos, and he burst into tears. And the next Shabbos, he saw someone breaking Shabbos, and he didn't burst into tears. And then 5 minutes later, he burst into tears. So, well, what's going on? So the first time I burst into tears, because to see a Jew violating Shabbos, denying Hashem's creation of the world, denying Yetziat Mitzrayim, denying this, publicly desecrating this basic connection of the Jewish people to Hashem, I spontaneously cried. The second time I'd already seen it, so I didn't cry. Why did I cry? I cried because I didn't cry the first time. Unfortunately, I don't cry when I see people break Shabbos. But also, I don't cry when I see a big concrete monstrosity on the land of Israel. And I should cry. Someone, I think, we're new to it. We're kind of brutalized to this ugliness around us, to the extent that it's a kind of conscious effort to notice it, but we should be genuinely upset. And you said something which I thought was very interesting, which is this is what our ancestors prayed for. And I mean, on a sort of basic factual level, there are plenty of printed books and manuscript books, depicting what Jews thought the Messianic age was like. And I challenge you to find one that looks in any sense remotely like Ramat Gan. And apart from all the other issues that our forefathers were praying for, Bet HaMikdash, our forefathers were praying for Sanhedrin, our forefathers were praying for a king and not for a democracy. Apart from all these many issues, our forefathers were not praying for this kind of soulless, alienated, capitalist civilization that we've stuck on this land. And we shouldn't do it, and we should get rid of it.
So just to touch on a few things you mentioned then. So I would Herod is arguably one of the greatest builders the Jewish people ever saw, in terms of the monuments he built, the cities he built, the temples he built. But it was a lot of the style was borrowed. It wasn't a traditionally Jewish, and it caused uproar in the time. He borrowed from the Romans, he borrowed from the Greeks, and we have no recorded Jewish architectural style. There may have been the first temple, and prior to that, there may have been a Jewish architectural style, but if there was, it's been lost for generations and generations and generations. And so then what you get to is you get to a whimsical, subjective take on what is good Goyish architecture. And maybe a good one to drop in is actually, I was going to do a separate question. Actually, no, I'll leave that. We've got another slide on architecture and some Jewish synagogues and another post you'd made, which I found really interesting, which we can come to, because actually, bizarrely, it's going to be a lot of architecture featured on this stream. I never thought the Israel advocacy movement would be hosting an architecture discussion. But the thing I really want to focus on is, I don't know, I'm sure you're aware of the term Salafi in terms of Salafi Islam. And Salafi Islam is going back to the original traditions of Muhammad and his companions. Now, most Jews don't take a Salafi approach to Judaism, in the sense that there's been 3,000 years of progression in the world. Much of that progression we've been instrumental in its development, whether it's the spread of monotheism, whether it's the spread of more modern philosophical and political ideas. We've been instrumental in most of that. So our contribution to the progression of mankind is almost incomparable to any other people. We have been so fundamental to the direction in which modern society, certainly modern Western society, has taken. And so when you try to come back to a tradition that you have no way of validating or verifying, it becomes very difficult. And I think architecture is the perfect example. You said in the style of the region, which I would assume is a more Middle Eastern style, more of an Arabic style. Like Jerusalem is a beautiful city. but that's not Jewish. The style isn't Jewish. So I guess putting the question back to you, like, while you don't like Ramat Gan and those big glass empty buildings, soulless buildings, would you accept that that is purely subjective and nothing to do with a Jewish position?
I don't accept it subjective at all. There is a huge amount of work that has been done on demonstrating how different types of images, different types of shapes, different types of color coordinations set off different receptors in the human brain. Humans aren't wired up all that differently, each one from each other. On this issue, by the way, racists are wrong. For example, I'll give you a very simple example. In Israel today, if you go to buy a cigarette and you want to buy Marlboro Red, you don't get a nice little red and white packet. And if you buy some Camels, you don't get a nice little yellow packet with a camel on it. You get the same packet, which is this kind of browny, tawny, yellowy color. And why did they choose that? Because they found scientifically it's the most ugly color. Okay, what does it mean it's the most ugly color? It means that you show it to people, you monitor their brain waves, and you find that people see this color and they are averse to it. And it's used as an official instrument of government policy to prevent people from smoking. And it works, by the way. It doesn't solve the whole issue, but it works because aesthetics are not a subjective issue. By the way, if people who are watching this take anything from the whole thing I'm saying, I very strongly recommend you go on Twitter and you look up a guy called Roth of Non spelt Gnon, who is a Twitter architecture specialist who with extensive pictures and research shows you about different traditional architecture styles from all around the world. I should add, no racism at all, don't have to worry. No vaccine skepticism either. I do not accept that these are subjective issues. Now, on the other claim you make, which is that what is an authentic Jewish style? There's never been an authentic Jewish style that we can actually recover. What we know of the Second Temple was clearly influenced by wider Greek styles. When I talk about a kind of a regionally appropriate style, I'm talking effectively about an Arab style. All of that is completely 100% true. Aesthetic styles and patterns change over time. They change over time based upon the material state of the culture, the economic systems of the culture that make certain forms of building either cheaper or less cheap, or more effective or less effective. And there's a great, there's cross-cultural pollination. Someone from Northern Europe goes to Italy and they say, wow, look at these amazing Renaissance buildings. I'm going to go build Christ College, Cambridge. Obviously all of this stuff happens. So I'm certainly not saying we should try and work out what they were living in Iron Age Israel in the time of King David, and we should start building that way. What I am saying is as follows. Every culture that has endured has built up its own beautiful style of vernacular architecture, which vernacular architecture means ordinary houses that people live in, ordinary town buildings, etc. And then there's high architecture on top, which is the churches, the mosques, the temples, whatever. And these cultures express the connection of a particular people with its territory, because in the first and the most basic sense, they're built upon the use of materials that are present where you are. And in the second sense, that over time, people practice and practice and practice over many generations, artisanal skills that are passed down from father to son. And they build up a national style which both reflects their character as a culture and also determines their character as a culture. And this is something that every culture that's worth its salt has to go through. And one of the many tragedies of our age that we live in is that the beautiful Dutch culture and the beautiful Thai culture and the beautiful Igbo culture and the beautiful Russian culture and all these beautiful cultures are subsumed under one culture, which is American culture, which would be bad enough if it was an above average culture. That in itself would be a massive loss to the diversity and richness of human experience. But actually, American culture is garbage and trash. And the more that it gets detached from its specifically American roots and becomes internationalized, It becomes even more garbage and trash. And this is a massive loss. So now, we as Jews returning to the land of Israel do not have our own architectural culture. We do not have our own artistic culture. We don't really have much of a culture at all. Now, Ashkenazi Jews have their culture, which is of course heavily influenced by being in Poland and Germany, etc. And Moroccan Jews have their culture, and Tunisian Jews have their culture, and those are all, good things as far as it goes. But there is, in point of fact, no Jewish culture. Now, I am, I'm not ashamed to say it, I'm an anti-Zionist, in a sense at least, that I believe that no one should be a Zionist. But I believe, and I believe this very strongly, that the early Zionists, Herzl, Nordau, etc., made very, very correct, very, very profound, and very, very powerful criticisms of the Jews as they existed at that time. And one of the things that they said is that you're not a proper culture because you're not organically connected to a particular land. You're mobile, you move around, you don't feel at home anywhere. And this has prevented you from doing what Poles can do, what Germans can do, what Italians can do, and what French can do, which is, well, look, what have they done? A national literature, a national architectural style, a national artistic style. Now, you can believe or not believe that they're all equally good. I don't. I think Italian culture is one of the world's greats, French culture as well. But let's say they're all equal. But let's say you completely disagree with me. Let's say you think Estonian culture is the peak of human existence. Doesn't matter. The point is that you as Jews, you live in a situation of galut. You've done what you've had to do to survive, okay? And you had to do that to survive because you were thrown, well, the Zionists didn't believe this, but traditional Jews believe this. You were thrown into galut as a punishment for your sins. And what the Zionists said is, you did what you had to do to survive, but now you need to get up to another level. You need to become a real, proper, human-rooted culture. And this is something. Now, while the early Zionists were not very good Jews at all, so Max Nordau married a non-Jew, and Theodor Herzl didn't circumcise his children. So they weren't very, very good Jews. But on a human level, I think they were kind of cool dudes, actually. That first early generation. And they were cool dudes, and they had some good criticisms of Jewish culture. Now, the later generation of Zionists, the ones who built the state, were not cool dudes. Some of them were actually slightly better Jews, but they really weren't good people. But the tragedy of the state of Israel is that those positive elements of early Zionism, at least the tragedy from my perspective, those positive elements of early Zionism have been forgotten about and lost. And basically, the sort of official and widespread Israeli view is that, yeah, we don't need any of that stuff. We don't need nice traditions because we got technology. We don't need artisanry because we have startups. We don't really need to make anything nice because we can just work in binary options and rook people who are less intelligent than us of our money. Now, obviously, it should be said that binary options is a kind of extreme negative outgrowth of the Israeli economy. I'm not saying all Israelis work in. By the way, you do know what binary options is, right? I can't hear you.
Explain to the audience.
Okay, so binary options, for the anti-Semites on the feed, this is your time. Binary options is unfortunately a thing that was very big in Tel Aviv until quite recently, and unfortunately still exists to some extent, which is basically, it pretends to be a new and innovative way of selling stocks, but actually it's just a fraud. You pay money, and if your stock goes up, we take your money, and if your stock goes down, we're also going to take your money. And by the way, this is not some fringe anti-Semite thing. If you search Times of Israel archives, Times of Israel is a newspaper that I think is a very, very bad publication. If anyone here is from the Times of Israel, I don't like you. But one thing that the Times of Israel did very well, it's a left-leaning publication, is that it devoted quite a lot of journalistic resources to exposing the binary options, I don't know, what do you want to call it, movement, economy in Tel Aviv and some other places, which thrived on taking Olim, who, they speak French, they speak English, they speak Portuguese, because a lot of them come from Brazil now, and they would call up people, French people, English-speaking people, and they would target them, and they would rook them of their money. And, I'd like to say this was a small thing, but this wasn't a small thing. Tens of thousands of people were working in this. Now, with that said, it's not the case that binary options is the whole of the Israeli economy, or that all Israelis work in binary options or something. But it is the case that binary options is the kind of extreme, negative, dark side of the wider Israeli economy, which is we can get by on our wits. We're Jews, we're smart. We don't really know how to make nice stuff. And we don't, who needs to know how to make nice stuff? That's for dumb people. We don't really know how to grow food. That's fine. We just bring in Filipinos to grow our food for us. And when their work permit runs out, we say, go home. No, sorry, I misspeak. Filipinos are brought in usually to run nursing, to work in nursing homes. It's Thais that we bring in to do all our agricultural work. And there you go, by the way, is another very perfect example. Famously, a massive part of the early Zionist movement is bringing Jews back to agriculture. It's saying it's not healthy that so many of you work in lending or merchant, trade and banking and all this stuff. It's not healthy. Some people are going to, you need a few merchants around, you need a few bankers, I guess. But, most people should be working in agriculture. It's not healthy that you alone among the nations, most of you guys are not working in agriculture. And again, this is a dream that has not been realized. Very, very few Israelis work in agriculture. Those who do work in agriculture don't employ other Jews for the most part. They employ Thais who, I don't know, it wouldn't be an exaggeration to call them indentured servants. They use, mass amounts of chemical fertilizer, which means that, and they feed their chickens and their cows on poison, which means that, I as a father have to feed my child poisonous chemicals because, he's got to eat something. And the model of, the Jew returning connected to the soil of Eretz Yisrael, planting trees, working the land with his hands and watching the fruit of his labor come to being, that the whole kibbutz vision, which again, on one side was done by these very atheist, anti-Jewish people, but on the other hand, from a human perspective at least, is a nice vision, hasn't come to pass. And it's not too much of an exaggeration to say that all of the good things about Zionism have not been realized in the Zionist project. And Zionism today is a vehicle for precisely those things that the early Zionists criticized about the Jews of Europe. And they've kind of recreated exilic Jewish society in the land of Israel, arguably in a worse form than it was in exile.
Okay, so there's an awful lot to unpack there. But one of the things that makes me the most nervous about the things that you mentioned is that it seems to be rooted in a real hostility to the state of Israel and the people that live within it. I'd say the Jews that live within it, where we can move on to Arabs and non-Jews. You touched on some of the foreign workers, but there seems a real hostility towards the people that live there. Everything that you described was in the negative. Very little focus on any of the positive. And I would argue the positive that gives you the luxury to sit where you're sitting today, to benefit from the electricity that you're using, all the incredible infrastructure that has been built up. And instead, there's a real focus for instance, the agriculture. Agriculture is actually a huge part of the Israeli economy. I think it's just under 5% of the economy, isn't it? Or it was a while ago, certainly around 2010 or something. I think it was around 5% of the industry. For a tiny nation with virtually no land, it's smaller than Wales and a desert. It's quite a phenomenal, to make a small space of a part of land, so a small amount of land, which is arid and desert, to turn that into actually a blooming In fact, make it bloom so much that you can actually turn it into one of your major exports, one of your major contributions to the world. It's not just that Israel is a startup nation and all we export is technology or finance. It's actually, no, we sell mangoes, we sell all manner of food, which we can get. I'm in the UK. I can go to Tesco and pick a produce that's grown in Israel. That's phenomenal.
Well, by the by, I mean, I don't know if you're aware of this. I mean, they don't sell that produce in Israel.
That's like most agriculture is not consumed by the nation it's grown in.
It's not the case in England. It's not the case in England that you sell your best fruit abroad. Obviously, England exports fruit. It's not the case. It's not the case that England exports its best fruit abroad, and the only stuff you can buy in your supermarket is like smelly and rotten, as it is in this country. By the by, I mean, this is not a major issue. My objection to Israeli agriculture is not in terms of what it does or not produce. Again, I should actually probably kind of go off on a side note here, which is another major feature of neo-reactionary thought that you can discuss with this chap in 2 days, is to flip your whole focus from looking at human beings as consumers to looking at human beings as workers. Modern economic and political theory is basically based on a kind of hedonic calculus, which is that people want stuff, and the more of the stuff that they want, that they're given, the better your system is functioning. Now, let's take an extreme example. I'm a crack addict. I want crack. So the best functioning economic system is the one where I can buy crack cheaply and conveniently. Now, obviously, we say, well, no, but crack's different because crack is an exception because you're addicted to crack. So that's different. We'll leave that one out. Okay, well, what about hamburgers? Okay, maybe I'm the person who likes to eat hamburgers. Hamburgers are not good for me. They don't make me a happier person. They don't make me a healthier person. They don't make me a better person. But I want hamburgers. Is the good economic system the one that gives me all the hamburgers I want, or is a good system a completely different kind of system? Now, with what I've just said hanging there as a kind of premise, my problem with Israeli agriculture is not what it produces and what it doesn't produce, although it's an interesting example of how the system functions and how it abuses its own citizens, that all of the best produce is sent abroad, even though officially this is like, number 20 now, we're the 20th wealthiest country in the world, and we perfectly well should be able to afford to eat kind of decent quality mango. But leave that aside. My problem is not that. My problem is, again, the original Zionist critique. Either they were right or they were wrong. I happen to believe they were right, which is that it's not healthy to be divorced from soil. It's not healthy to live in a concrete pod. It's not healthy to have to turn on air conditioning all day long. And this now we're talking about at least 95% of Israeli homes. It's not healthy to have to turn on air conditioning in order simply to function and live in my home, because my home was built with complete rampant disregard for all basic and traditional principles of architecture and the needs of the human body. We have in certain senses a profitable agricultural industry, but again, it doesn't employ Jews. It doesn't employ Thais, by the way, in a way that's benefiting Thais. Working, 12, 14-hour days, without a break for hardly any money, and then being kicked out of the country when you're too old to do it anymore, is also not, I think, a way of life that's really conducive to human flourishing. But the point is that Jews are completely, for the most part, completely shut out of this capitalist mass agriculture model as workers. What that means is a very important, what you actually do most of your life is not consume. What you do most of your life is work. What really affects whether you're a happy person, a good person, a virtuous person, is not the number of consumer goods that you consume. Probably on balance, the more consumer goods that you get, the worse person you become. That's probably true most of the time, at least 50%. What makes you a better person, a happier person, more virtuous person, is what you spend your day doing. If you spend your day, for example, as a carpenter or as a skilled metal worker, and over years after years after years, you see that the things you produce with your hands become higher quality, progressively higher quality. You get this constant sense of greater emotional satisfaction. You can see yourself becoming a higher grade of human being. That's a very, very great thing. If, on the other hand, you're just kind of selling people crap that they don't need, that actually they would be better off not having, that doesn't make you a good person. It makes you a more depressed person. Usually it makes you a much fatter person. And by the way, I speak from experience. I worked for 1.5 years in marketing because, like a lot of olim, I found it very, very hard to find decent employment. I worked in marketing and computers. I have nothing but the nicest things to say about my boss. He was a lovely person who really tried his best. But the simple nature of the job in itself was debilitating to a human being. And again, most Israelis live in a concrete box. If they step outside their house, they don't have public spaces where they can kind of congregate naturally as a community. Large parts, it's hard even in some places to just find something as basic as a bit of shade. So you live in your concrete box with your air conditioning, with your DVDs and, all your consumer goods that we can get because of our amazing economy. You get in a car and spend, an hour and a half pumping poisonous fumes into the air of Eretz Israel. The wheels on your tire, when they rub on the thing, they emit nanoplastics that get washed down by the rain and flow into the ocean and poison the fish. Then you get to your job, you sit in some stupid office, which is also a concrete box, which is also air conditioned, tapping away at some computer, watching your back distort itself until you need opiates to be able to kind of function every day. And then you drive back an hour and a half, you're exhausted and you go to bed. And this is the life, and it's not even for a decrease, it's for an increasing proportion. More and more people in Israel are stuck in this economic model, which, it's true, produces a superfluity of consumer goods and allows me to have electricity so I can sit on a computer and complain about it. But on the other hand, it's just not conducive to the flourishing of human beings. And I think that the Jewish people have enormous potential. I actually think all human beings have enormous potential. All the races of mankind, all the nations and ethnicities have enormous potential. But I'll be willing to say something a bit racist and say I think the Jews have actually even more potential than the other ones. And I believe that potential is being wasted systematically, and I'd go as far as to say cruelly, by the Israeli system. And if you don't want to take it from me, don't take it from me. Go read the works of Max Nordau. Go read the works of even Herzl. Go read the Judenstaat and just look at what he's talking about what a flourishing people looks like, and just compare it point by point to what we actually have in Israel today. Not what we have in Israel in Hasbara, in our extremely well-funded PR industry, but what actually ordinary Jews are subjected to every single day of their life. And it's just not good enough.
Okay, so I would put it to you that your critique is not a critique of Zionism, but a critique of modernity, as a critique of capitalism. And the system that you criticize, like we can come back to Zionism, but the system that you criticize, which is capitalism, has created a generation which Herzl couldn't have imagined. If you actually read Herzl's writing, what was Herzl focused? So his state building was crazy. His socialism, like this crazy. What did he call it? He called it aristocratic. Oh, I forgot how he framed it. But basically, he looked up to the aristocrats, but then he wanted like an aristocratic class, but socialism at the same time. I have to go back. I have to read his diaries. I can't remember. But his politics were crazy, absolutely crazy. And every time people have tried to impose politics of that nature, forget the aristocrat aspect, but just try to impose centrally planned economies, it's ended up in absolute disaster. And capitalism, on the other hand, we have the lowest mortality rates mankind has ever known. We have an abundance of food. We have literacy rates which are unparalleled. Like, capitalism has done phenomenal for lifting the conditions of humanity. And Herzl and Nordau, and all the early Zionists were products of their generation. They were swept up in the zeitgeist that was sweeping up Europeans, and they were repeating what they're. So Herzl's vision of a Jewish state had very little Jewish in it, other than the group. Even like when it came to Israel, he said like the Jews don't have the temperament to live there, kind of echoing what you're saying with the air conditioning. What he failed to mention was there was over 1 million Jews living in those very conditions. He had a very ethnocentric Ashkenazi, not even Ashkenazi, European nobility-centric view as to what a good state should be and how one can protect the Jewish people. But what concerns me with what you're painting is the number, just the sheer amount of moral judgments that you make and someone has to make. Capitalism is very good at enabling the population to attribute value to something. So I don't know enough about binary options. I don't know if binary options are good or bad, so I'm going to ignore that. I can't comment on that. I'm sure there's people in the chat which are pulling their hair out, who are traders and know what a binary option is and whether it's good, whether it's bad. I can't comment. It's not an area right now. But if I look at the things I do know that come out of Israel, the tech innovations, the exports, Israel contributes immeasurably to society, and the value is placed on those things that Israel exports and provides to the world. Similarly, when it comes to workers working there, I completely agree, there are migrant workers who come and they work in Israel and they leave. They wouldn't come if it wasn't in their financial interest to do so. So again, there is a value that's assigned by the market and not by Gabriel or Joseph, or the Sanhedrin, or whoever is planning and assigning value for what gets done. And so I didn't imagine this was going to go into a capitalist type defense. I'm not the best person. I debate Zionism on a daily basis. I don't debate capitalism. But what I would argue is that everything that you described is hugely subjective and truthfully can be argued. So Israel doesn't have good fruit and veg. Well, that's not my experience. Maybe I go to better shops than you. Maybe I go to more expensive shops than you. You live there. I don't. But you can get very good produce. What I would say is it's very expensive. I would argue Israel is ridiculously expensive when it comes to fruit and vegetable. But again, that's a combination of the market and the way that a few shopping or importers have a monopoly on the industry there. And capitalism will be the thing that breaks that, not centrally planned economies. And so I think the thing that concerns me with what you're presenting is you assign a moral judgment to everything, and you're the one that's making that judgment call. So it's good to work on the land. It's not good to work at computers. I would argue somebody working on computers can make a medical breakthrough that could save millions of lives, whereas someone growing some oranges in an orange grove maybe can't make as great a contribution. And both of those will be recompensed and the market will find a value for both of those outputs. Someone growing oranges is less likely to make the same money as someone producing some incredible medical breakthrough, which they did in their air-conditioned box, sitting in front of a computer, tapping away. I would say one enriches society and mankind to a degree that the other doesn't. I don't think all things are equal. I'm not a Marxist. I don't think that the orange grove worker should get paid the same amount as the person who's creating a huge medical breakthrough. And I know you didn't say that, but you are attributing a moral judgment and I'd assume a value judgment onto what it is that people are producing. I hope I didn't straw man you then. If I did,
No, that's fine. One thing you said, which is certainly extremely correct, is that I say I'm criticizing Zionism, but what I'm actually criticizing is kind of technological capitalist modernity. And that's, in one sense, completely true. And part of my critique is that Zionism is, what is the relationship of Zionism to the Jewish people right now? Zionism is the vehicle by which the international capitalist system imposes itself upon the Jewish people. Now, one thing you should talk about with this nameless neo-reactionary you're going to talk to in 2 days, this is a very important point of neo-reactionary thought, is that the modern political spectrum is set up. You've got one side, you've got capitalism, and then in one side you've got fascism. One side you've got socialism. Now, no one really knows where to put fascism. Maybe it's a horseshoe, maybe it's to the right of capitalism, whatever. But the basic, you're not allowed to be a fascist anyway, so it doesn't really matter. The basic poles by which you can exist on, if you want to be, allowed to exist in normal society, is socialism is here and capitalism is here. And what you need to do is to completely recalibrate your political map. So, somewhere around here, this is socialism and capitalism. And all around here is all the different interesting human ideas that people have had over the course of history and different ways of running economic systems. And you just need to get out of this dichotomy. What this does, the second someone starts pointing out why capitalism is not good, boom, you must want to have socialism. The second you point out why socialism is not good, boom, you must want to have capitalism. I reject socialism and I reject capitalism with equal fervor and hostility. But again, now, so that's a meta point, I suppose you get. But again, I want to get back to something. Now, let's say that these guys tapping away in their computers produce more than the orange farmer. Now, I think this is really only true in the field of medical technology. The only place that people, and this is why people always come back to it, the only place where people can really point to say, why is modernity a good thing? Why is capitalism a good thing? Because look at all the great medicine we have. Now, even that, to be honest, is running out of steam, because what modern capitalist medicine is very good at is stretching out people's lives in a kind of miserable way. So people live longer, but you have more obese people than you've ever had in human history. You've got simultaneously more weaklings who just can't do basic stuff that, is really basic to being a human being, like just climb a tree, huge amounts of people can't even walk. You just walk around and see people in mobility scooters. This is a real failure of us as human beings to just maximize our potential. Let's exercise our minimum potential as human beings, okay? And then what happens is you get something like COVID, which objectively speaking is a mild flu. Sorry, YouTube, okay? And then because of that, but because you have a population of people who are so weak and unhealthy, but their lives are stretched out by modern medical technology, huge amounts of them just can get knocked out like paper. And the only solution you have is to do something unprecedented in human history and just lock entire countries in their houses. And then, you can go, imagine if you went to some Anglo-Saxon peasant, you said, your life sucks. You don't have electricity. You don't have high tech. You don't have computers. You don't have DVDs. You don't even know what The Sopranos is. Okay, right? And you know what I say back to you? Yeah, but no one's going to lock me in my house because of the flu. All right. And so you have to. Now, so let's go back from the medical technology. Most of what actually I think these people do in Israel, at least, is actually, again, selling people things, new complicated technologies they don't need, that pollute the earth, that destroy animal life, that destroy habitats, that destroy the environment. But again, even if it was true, I'm not so much concerned about what the orange producer produces versus what the guy on the keyboard produces. I'm concerned about what doing these kinds of works does to the guy who's growing the orange trees versus the guy who's on the computer. I'm concerned which one can go back to his family at night and play with them because he is strong, healthy, happy, because he does things that are in tune with his basic biology, which was given to him by God, or someone who goes back and has to pop a bunch of opiates because his back hurts him so much, because he's been sitting in a position that he was never designed to sit in the first place. And he has to kind of somatize himself with DVDs and iPhones and all this stuff that basically to distract him from, he has a lot of stuff, but his life is not very good. Now, your point was that I'm making a lot of moral judgments. Yeah, all right.
But what if I
That's
disagree
true.
with? But what if I disagree with it? No. In a sense that the thing that worries me with a society like the one you're painting is someone makes those moral judgments and imposes them on me. And the other thing which I think is really pivotal to crucial to everything that you're saying, and it doesn't work unless you do this, and I don't think it's fair, is that you will take extremes and present that as if that's normative. And so you will make a statement like people are on mobility scooters, they can't even walk, they're weaklings. But that's not reality. Most people don't use mobility scooters. Most people are actually completely capable of climbing a tree. In reality, the overwhelming majority of adults can climb a tree. We are strong enough to climb trees. I mean, there will definitely be outliers that can't. And there will definitely be outliers that are incredibly strong. But as a whole,
you're not disputing that 40% of Americans, they have to update it every year now. 40% of Americans are clinically obese.
Well, we're talking about Israel, and I'm in the UK, so forget about Americans. You're not
disputing that all of these problems are getting worse, are you?
What I would say is you're taking non-Jewish political ideas, so you're doing what? Fine. As an example, what I find fascinating here is when you have the Black Lives Matter protests in the UK and they're walking around going, hands up, don't shoot. It's like, wait a minute. The police here don't carry arms. That slogan works in America where the police are armed and shoot people. It doesn't work in the UK. And American politics gets imported. And so, America may have an obesity problem. I wouldn't argue with that. I think nobody would argue there's an issue with obesity in America.
Objectively speaking, Israel has a very serious obesity problem. Just Google it. A serious and worsening obesity problem. And by the way, while our government, ostensibly for the purpose of protecting our own health, has made us cover our faces, has closed down synagogues, has locked us in our own homes, they do nothing and continue to do nothing about the ongoing rising obesity epidemic. And you may sort of say, well, why? Now, your point about importing American politics. Now, why do people in Britain and Sweden and Korea go around talking about George Floyd as if it's a very, very relevant issue to them, whether or not some junkie criminal was illicitly murdered or, was it second degree or manslaughter or whatever? The answer is because all these countries are provinces of the American Empire. How do you know they're provinces of the American Empire? Well, actually, it's quite easy because they have American military bases on their soil. And what kind of countries let you have American military bases on their soil? Oh, yes, it means you're project of their empire. Israel is also, objectively speaking, and in a very obvious way, a province of the American Empire. That is how any historian 200 years from now, even 100 years from now, will see it. Now, you're going to say, well, it's not because we have our own president and we have our own constitution, and nowhere is it written anywhere. And nowhere is it written anywhere that we're part of the American Empire. And then you'll actually find that by the same kind of logic, if you went back historically, you can prove that all sorts of parts of the Ottoman Empire were also not part of the Ottoman Empire, because nowhere is it written anywhere that they were part of the Ottoman Empire. In any kind of normal objective historical terms, we are a province of the American Empire. Like many provinces, we have a degree of independence. And to some extent, our internal politics are very highly correlated with factions within the American political structure. So the standout example of this is when Benjamin Netanyahu lost his position within the Likud. He used his connections with the neoconservative movement in America to basically get himself back in charge of the Likud. And one of the things he did there is he worked with people who had some rather zany vision for democratizing the Middle East, which involved invading Iraq. And I personally believe that Benjamin Netanyahu knew that the whole thing was kind of a joke and it was never going to work, but he just thought it was a price, hundreds of thousands of dead Iraqis was a price worth paying for his own political advancement within the Likud. And he used that. So that is a very clear standout and easily documented example of how our politics are dependent on what's going on in the United States in a way that simply is not the case in countries that are independent. And therefore, you have no choice if you're serious about wanting to think about what Judaism looks like in the land of Israel circa 2021, Leminyanam. You have no choice but to understand things in terms of a global American system that has been going now for 70 years, which looks like it's showing some pretty advanced signs of decay, but will almost certainly go on for many more decades at least. And you have to deal with that reality. Just like if you're talking about what a Jewish society looks like at the time of Ezra and Nehemiah, you can't just pretend you're not part of the Persian Empire. You are part of the Persian Empire. You have a certain degree of independence. It's not like every single thing gets kicked up to the Persian emperor, certainly not. But you have to understand you're living under this military umbrella, just like, by the way, in the last kings of Bayat Rishon were really part of the Babylonian Empire, which is why when they fight against Nebuchadnezzar, it's called, in Tanakh itself, it's called a mered, it's called a rebellion, because they were already considered to be a subject tributary power before Churban Bayat Rishon. The Jewish people have spent a lot of time in Galut, but we have also spent a lot of time in our own country under subjugation to foreign powers, whether it be the Seleucid Empire, the Persian Empire, the Babylonian Empire, the Roman Empire, and now, in our own age, the American Empire. And this is just the reality and the context. So saying that I shouldn't be talking about it, it seems to me to be the opposite of the truth. That's what we have to talk about. We have to talk about, given that America runs the world, given that there's really only a couple of independent countries, namely China, North Korea, and we don't particularly want to emulate them either, what they've had to do to achieve independence, we have to work out a way to manage our position within the American order, which is, to be honest, the truth is this is what the current Zionist regime is doing. And you could even argue that, given the realities, they're not even doing such a bad job, because what are they supposed to do? Just tell this whole economic system to just, go hang? I guess not. Okay, but so, perhaps we should get a bit more focused.
Yeah, so I'd just like to touch on a few things there. So, and I think it's you throw out lots of statements, you make an awful lot of claims, and I think one of the things that's interesting is then fact checking the various things that you say. So some of it is incredibly subjective, and how do I convince you otherwise, and how do you convince me otherwise? Is virtually impossible. So is Israel a province of America? I would say no. We have democratic elections which elect the government. The people choose who gets into power, not the American government. The policies that were implemented are set by Israel. Certainly when it comes to Judea and Samaria, we have a very, very radically different policy to what has been pushed by the White House since 1967. And by every stretch, Israel is an independent. There is no US military base on Israeli soil. But one of the other things you said that Israel is like America is when it comes to obesity. So you can actually say on the obesity index, Israel's lower than the UK. Most of the audience watching are in the UK. Israel has less of an obesity issue than the UK. It has less of an obesity issue than Palestine. What would they call Palestine in the obesity index?
Wait 1 second. What's the number? What proportion of Israelis?
So this is from the Global Obesity Observatory, and they have an index, and this is looking at adult males. You can either do adult males versus females. So there's lots of small islands and stuff are occupying the first spot. The US comes in at number 14, and that's 36.5% of the population are obese. Kuwait is 34.3%. Qatar is 33.5%. Saudis 31.73%. New Zealand 31%. Australia 30.6%. What's the common theme with all of these? The affluent nations. Like when we actually get the largest countries rather than little islands. Canada 30.5%. Jordan 29.17%. UK 27.9%. What they call Palestine 27.2%. Then it's Israel, 26.9%. So Israel is
stop.
32.
More than 1/4 of adult males in this country are obese. Is that acceptable to you?
But that's the case at the first.
Forget that. No.
I'm looking at the global population. Yeah. So
this is a bad system. It's an international bad system.
No, but when you
Again,
drop down to low, when you're going under, when you get to low quality, with the exception of places like Japan, which is incredible, Japan has like 5% obesity, which is amazing.
okay, so
And it doesn't become what you don't get more capitalist than Japan. So it's not a capitalist thing;
well,
it's a cultural thing. Well, no, you don't. Japan
well,
is a very capitalist society, very
the
consumerist.
way that Japan has, obviously, Japan is also a subject province of the American Empire, with a, like us, with a certain degree of independence. Japan in itself, how it's managed to avoid the worst pathologies of modernity, is in itself an interesting topic, but probably one we don't have time for here. But again, let's, you can try and look, again, you can make yourself feel better. You can say, look, 1 in 4 adult males in my country are obese, something that is completely avoidable,
But what
which
was it
could
like
easily be got down to 0%.
What are you comparing it to? Are you comparing it to the Victorian era when everyone was, the majority were impoverished? Are you comparing it to the feudal systems where you had a serf class? Like, I don't know what obesity rates were like in the 16th century Britain, and I'd imagine nor do you. I would imagine, unless you do know what obesity rates were, because you're saying 20% and 25% is too high. But what are you comparing that to?
Well, okay, for a start, why don't we start by comparing it to Japan? We see that it's perfectly possible and within our powers to get it down to 5%. Why can't we get it down to 5%? But wait a second.
It could be down to so many things.
Okay,
it's certainly not down to consumerism, because Japan is as consumerist.
When something, okay, consumerism is a big word, capitalism is a big word. When something that is very, very unnatural reaches these kind of extents and is getting worse, that should be a warning sign to you that your society has picked an extraordinarily wrong way of running itself, of governing itself, of organizing itself. And again, obesity is just, you've chosen to focus on obesity. I can focus on a million things. And you're just going to say, well, there are countries in the world that are even worse. Okay, my standard is not, I live in a decaying American global order, and some parts of this order are even worse than my little corner of it. My standard is, I want a society where every single Jew is given not just a chance, but the actual practical ability to thrive, to fulfill his God-given talents and potential. Now, you're going to say, well, that's just utopia. Okay.
Precisely. And I'll go one further, Gabrielle, one further. Give me a society which had it better. Because, yes, we can all paint a utopia, and my utopia will look different to your utopia. So I'm saying, give me an example of something that is better than the Israeli society that you live in today. And then we can maybe measure, we can compare, we can look at whatever measures you think make a society better. And so give me that example of a better society than the Zionist society you live in today.
Okay, my general view, and again, you can take this up with the neo-reactionary chap in 2 days and see if he agrees, is that humans developed ways of living over many, many thousands of years. And there were problems with those ways, many which were intractable given the current level of technology. And the right path for humanity, that's when we started this big technological takeoff, would have been to use new technology to fix those problems, to preserve the pre-existing ways of life, and to fix the problems that existed within it. What we in fact did as a species, not as a Jewish people, as a species. The Jewish people got in this late. As a species, we constructed an entirely new way of living, right down to the very basics, the physical structures which you live in, the actions that you perform throughout your day are just totally different to how people live for their entire history of the human race. And that's true whether you believe the world is 6,000 years old or you believe the world is 6 billion years old. Now, there are little kind of things you can do to awaken yourself. Where do you live, by the way? You live somewhere in London, I presume.
Yeah, Northwest. I get too many death threats to say the exact location, but yeah, Northwest.
Right. You already said you're diving at the Adeni Shore, so people can figure it out.
Okay. You're giving away. There's
all right.
There's three.
Okay, so go to the National Gallery. Okay, And again, forget everything you know about how much progress there's been and how we've reached much higher levels of humanity. Go to the National Gallery and go to the Renaissance section and just look around and just think, am I looking at things that are the works of people operating at their highest possible level? Or am I looking at complete garbage? And then do it for different after era. And then look at the post-1945 section. And you look, what of the raw material of humanity, what are we actually, and again, I'm perfectly open about this. I'm not just talking about Israel. I'm even not specifically talking about Israel, although you can do the exact same thing in the Israel Museum and the results are just as ghastly. What are we making of the human race? So you can look at the art. You can look at the architecture. You can look at these very clear, visceral, physical things that are telling you something is terribly, terribly wrong with the world you live in. And then you can go and look at statistics and say, oh, child mortality, blah, 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 technology. Yeah, it's all amazing. Okay? You can listen to your eyes and your heart, what they're telling you. And then you live in England. Go to York. Don't spend the night, Machlukas. Go to York and go to the old Jewish quarter. Okay, look at a place that was made specifically. It's like a one street called Jew Street that was specifically made and designed to degrade human beings, to put Jews in their place and say, you think you're so great. Well, you're going to have to live in this place to show that you're not so great. And and then forget about history. Look around, and what do you see? And you know what you think? Wow, this is nice. Because whenever you visit anywhere that was built before the American conquest of the world, it doesn't matter if it's Thailand, it doesn't matter if it's Florence, it doesn't matter if it's the Netherlands. What you look around, what you see, you think, wow, this is amazing. This was something that was built by peasants for peasants, by working class people for working class people. And this is so much better than anyone that in the world that I live in can even possibly hope to achieve. I can't possibly imagine being able to give this to my, you can go to Jaffa, you can find houses that were built by illiterate Arab craftsmen for illiterate Arab craftsmen, and they now sell for billions of dollars to wealthy Americans who want a place to stay because they're so much nicer than anything. And then you believe in the market economy. Well, here's the market economy speaking. What's the nicest district? What are the most expensive districts of Jerusalem, where I live? Okay, it's simple. Anything that was built before the Zionists turned up, anything. It doesn't matter if it was built by Arabs. It doesn't matter if it was built by Jews. People go there and they automatically feel better. And the superior quality of living that you're able to find in places like Mishkanot Sha'ananim or the Old City, anything that was built before this modern system was developed around us, is light years better. And they say, why can't we do this now? Now, I'm not saying I or the neo-reactionaries have figured every single element of this out. What I've got, I and they have got certain steps of the thing worked out, certain elements of the theory of describing descriptively how our socio-economic system works, how other socio-economic systems work. But what I can tell you is something is terribly, terribly, terribly wrong. Again, have you ever been to Florence?
No.
You should. Okay, go to Florence or Venice. Okay, and just look around. Now, unfortunately, most of the some of the nicest art and stuff you can't go into because it's a church unless you can get some super modern Orthodox rabbi to give you a heter, okay, which I once did. So, bully for me, back in the day. And you can see, these are people, you compare the population then to the population now. You compare the surplus material resources available to them then to the surplus material resources available to them now. Logically speaking, if we're just kind of holding even, we should be able to produce hundreds of times the amount of beautiful, stunning things that reflect humanity operating at its top potential. And we can't produce even half of 1%. Half of 1%.
This is
everything we produce now is garbage.
It's subjective elitism.
No, it's not.
I'll give you an example.
It's not subjective.
You look at St. Paul's, or Durham Cathedral, or York Cathedral, and you would say these are great expressions of human creativity, high architecture at its finest. I look at the
low architecture.
I look at the Burj Khalifa, and I'm sure if you took Christopher Wren and showed him the Burj Khalifa, he would respond in a very different way to you, because what you're describing is subjective. You look at the Renaissance, you look at the masters, the painters, and you think, wow, this is unlike anything. But if you were to show them just what some 15-year-old kid can produce on his computer in terms of musical expression, they would be blown away. Art evolves and is deeply subjective.
Sorry, music. You're going to compare Beethoven and Mozart and Handel to what? Britney Spears? What are you talking about?
So again,
how can you be serious?
It's again what you're doing, Gabriel. You're taking an artist who was the finest of his generation, yeah.
So who's the finest of our generation?
Hear me out. So much so that it's been preserved through generations and generations and generations, and then comparing that to random artists from today. In 200 years' time, there will be artists which will have been sustained, which will last the course of time, like Beethoven did. You can't take the best of a generation and general popular culture.
Name one. Name one.
Name one artist. The Beatles.
Name one. The Beatles. This is your serious answer to the question. The Beatles are, again, with a global population, multiple, 3 times larger, at least, than in the time of Beethoven, with surplus resources hundreds of times larger. The best that our world can produce in comparison to the world that produced Beethoven is the Beatles. That is your serious answer.
I mean, do you know musical theory? Gabriel, do you know musical theory?
I don't think I even need to say anymore. I think that we have kind of established that there's something deeply wrong.
From a musical theory perspective, what makes Beethoven superior to the Beatles? Just explain it to me, because I'm ignorant to musical theory.
Right. So okay. Musical theory is not my expertise. If you're really serious,
so then it's your belief.
No, if you're really serious, just sit down and listen to it. And this is part of the problem. Now, I should say it's not elitist, because one thing that's very important is that
Gabriel, I'll just jump in. There's a great debate between Destiny and I've forgotten the white supremacist who uses the exact same argument. I'm not going to do it justice. I recommend Destiny's a YouTuber, a Twitch streamer. He does a fantastic thing where a white supremacist comes on and says the exact same thing about Beethoven and Mozart. And Destiny is classically musically trained. He's studied music at university, and he absolutely shreds the guy on the complexity of modern popular music today compared to what was being produced. Now, I'm not going to do that argument. It sounds like neither of us are qualified to have that.
It's exactly the opposite of what you're saying.
2 minutes. Neither of us are qualified to talk about musical theory. We have our opinions. I can tell you one thing. I listen to more popular music than I do listen to classical music, which suggests, for me, subjectively, I prefer the more popular music. Does that make it better? I don't know. Does that make me a consumer or a product of modernity? Probably. But neither of us are qualified to talk about what makes music. It sounds a similar situation with architecture. You're looking at the buildings that you see around you and you don't like them. You look at the skyline of London or Tel Aviv and you don't like the skyline. But again, it's a subjective judgment on that society.
Okay.
It's not an objective. It's not a fact. It's not a fact. Is it 2 minutes? It's not a fact that a little street in York is superior to the Burj Khalifa. That's not a subjective. An objective fact. That's your opinion. Yeah.
Sorry, I haven't been in England long enough. What is this Burj Khalifa? I'm just going to.
Burj Khalifa is it's one of the tallest buildings in the world. I think the tallest building in the world. And with the name Khalifa, it's definitely not in the UK.
Okay, I'm looking at it now. All right, now you said I'm being elitist. Now, actually, it's literally the opposite of the case. There is one exception to this rule, which is music, where the masses do, in fact, genuinely prefer popular music to classical music. But with architecture and with art, consistently, all the time, every single time, ordinary people are asked. They say, we hate this stuff, stop building this stuff, stop abusing us with this stuff, stop abusing us with this art, stop, making us pay for this art, which is, modern liberal states are so kind of just ostentatiously rude that they tax people to kind of pay for someone's unmade bed, okay. And wait, the only people who can justify why this stuff is better, in fact, are qualified experts who go to university to learn how to put words together in sort of nonsense phrases to explain why something that viscerally at a core gut level appalls the human senses actually is just as good as something nice. Now, one thing is the quality of our grand architecture, which again, any reasonable person can see that we are in basically a dark ages. But that's actually not my main point. My main point is not the great churches, the great cathedrals, the great synagogues. There are many very beautiful synagogues in Europe, although not as many as great churches. My point is the houses that ordinary people go to live in. People pay huge amounts of money to go live in Greek villages, literally inhabited by shepherds, and they will pay a month's salary so they can get out of their horrendous concrete hellhole that makes them feel miserable. And they go and spend 2 weeks. They don't do anything in particular. They just walk around somewhere nice, and they feel much better. And they write letters back saying, "It's so nice being here. Everything's so nice."
So you've done it again, though.
This is not elitist. This is modern architecture, as a point of factual matter, was designed by elitist architects who trained in fancy universities, many of whom had sort of all sorts of balmy ideas, and the elite capitalist political and economic system that imposes these things on people and does not, in fact, give people a choice. When people earn enough money to have the choice of where they want to live, they invariably choose to live in places that were built before 1945, which is why all of these places are far too expensive for ordinary people to live in. It is simply not true that this is coming from popular demand. It comes from a overall political and economic system that generates this stuff, from a civilization that demonstrates its own internal emptiness, and I would go farther and say wickedness, in the physical entities it sticks onto God's soil.
So I'm going to add one thing, then we'll open the conversation up to questions, because there's been loads of questions. The chat's been going crazy. Some people really like you. They're calling you base. A few white supremacists coming on, and they've really enjoyed what you've had to say. Base Jew has been in the comments. There's also been a lot of very frustrated Zionists, so we'll definitely open the questions up to them. But I think that the one thing I'd like to focus in on, and you did it again, and it's, you look at the... So I come from, you have a very bourgeois perspective, to borrow an expression.
It's elite, it's bourgeois. Okay, I mean, it can't be both.
I mean, no, okay. It can be both. And so, so what I was saying with that is, if you look at the average house that a person in Israel lives in today, and the average house that a person in the UK lives in today, and you compare that to what people in those regions lived in, the average, the working man, the proletariat, and compared it to what they were living in 300 years ago, it's immeasurably better. If you look at the houses, so if you go to York, the community in York was relatively affluent in the UK until they were executed for being Jewish, which is an important detail in the conversation that we're having. If you actually compare like for like, and it's kind of where I started from with the beginning of the conversation, it's immeasurably better. So the average house that the average person lives in today is more attractive than it's more attractive than their equivalent would have lived in 300 years ago. 100%. They lived in like mud huts and wooden shacks. It's like what we're living in today is architecturally more.
First of all, okay, we're not talking about Africa. Okay, where are these mud huts?
About the UK and Israel.
Go find me a mud hut from 300 years ago in Sheffield. And also, I'm going to be perfectly frank, even an Igbo mud hut is significantly preferable to these, Google Harish. Google image search Harish. I invite everyone on this chat, Google image search Harish. I say without hesitating for a second, and in the most primitive part of Africa, the mud huts they live in are infinitely preferable to what they are building there. Now, by the way, huge parts of Africa are also horrendously ugly because they also have the same capitalist architecture, and it's even worse because they have no spare money to make it nice. But
so can you see that? I'll zoom in so it's even bigger. So you're saying a mud hut is more attractive than that?
Yes.
I disagree. Where do we go from there? I disagree. Where do we go from there?
And by the way, it's not just that. If you live in Harish, I visited Harish, once or twice, And, it's actually extremely unlivable. First of all, as I mentioned before, they build these houses, l'chatchila. L'chatchila for the non-Jewish readers means kind of, it's a bit hard. The reason I use the Hebrew word is it means intending from the start. It's built, intending from the start, out of these concrete materials, which they know means that you simply cannot live in it physically without having your air conditioning on all day. Air conditioning is extremely expensive, but the property company doesn't care because you're paying, they're not paying. Air conditioning is also extremely bad for you. It regurgitates germs in you and your children and makes them, weak, and damages their immune system so that, well, that's back to the whole COVID issue. But also when you step out of these places, you cannot get anywhere without getting in your car. So again, you're polluting the land of Israel and damaging it, and you have to tarmac over huge sections of it. But also the natural kind of physical layout of a traditional community, which brings people together and has been honed over thousands of years to support community, support togetherness, does not exist in these places, and people lead extraordinarily atomized and miserable lives. The only groups in Israel the only Jewish group who really manages to escape this is Haredim, because even though they live in basically the same kind of physical conditions, they have this kind of system that they've worked on, which kind of they can just sort of stick on top, and it doesn't really matter. You can be in New York, you can be in Bnei Brak, you can be in London, and the whole system just kind of works, and you can carve out for yourself a kind of decent sort of semi-decent kind of human existence. But the ordinary Israeli, they are I mean this, they are abused by their government. They should not have to live this way. And again, building courtyards, building houses in such a way that they are situated in the sun, that they are built out of materials that are insulating, is not hard. Illiterate peasants 200 years ago knew perfectly well how to do this. With our technology, we could do it 100 times better. Instead, we decide to do a completely different thing that is much worse. That is the basic problem with the modern world. That is the basic problem with Zionism, because Zionism is the funnel through which the modern world goes into the Jewish people. We've only really talked about architecture and economy. Obviously, there's the whole ideological thing, the whole in the sphere of values and ideas. But
before we get, let's close the chapter. And to play back, and I try to be as charitable as I can with the people I speak to now, because it's very easy to straw man. If I'm going to play back what I think I've heard you saying, tell me if I am wrong. You believe that previous generations had aesthetically more attractive, more creative,
less creative.
Okay, less creative, but more aesthetically pleasing outputs, be it buildings, be it art, be it whatever. So previous generations had it better. And today's society, Israel is just an expression of American cultural imperialism. Would that be a fair read of what you're saying? So architecturally,
yes.
Yeah.
There's a little bit of Jewish, there's a little bit of local spice added. We didn't even get into this. The local spice is mostly makes it even worse. It's bad spice. But anyway, go on. That one of the posts you didn't mention that you saw on my Facebook was about national religious synagogues, where they have they have loads of money and these things are unbelievable.
So I'll share my screen. That may be one thing we agree on. We haven't agreed on a lot, but this is definitely one of the things that we will agree on. So if you just talk us through what it is we're looking at before we.
All right. So look, this is not the best. This is not the best example. We could possibly have picked. Bottom left is just a traditional European shul, obviously in France, built to basically mimic the local Catholic style. Okay, but let's ignore that for a second. Let's look at these things on the right. One is a shul in Gush Katif, which no longer exists, obviously, because Ariel Sharon gave it to the Arabs and they destroyed it. And maybe they even dismantled it before. I don't know exactly. And one is Merkaz Arav Yeshiva, which is the top national religious yeshiva, the biggie, the center. I mean, Merkaz Arav is actually not the worst building in the world, but it illustrates in a kind of, it's much older than most of them, obviously because it's a very well-established, prestigious yeshiva. But it illustrates this kind of Israeli Zionist style, which is to do lots of jutting shapes, which are put together discordantly, and an extreme disharmony and brutalism with an absence of anything kind of resembling just a curve. Please, for the love of God, just give me a curve, something to soften the offensive terror of these buildings. And I compared it to the only historical architectural style I know that really approximates to this is these very, very large Sumerian/Babylonian structures that you find in Iraq, which again have this same intense straight lines and discordant straight line shapes. And there are even better examples that you can find. Go do a Google image search and start looking for national religious shawls in Israel. And again, the more money they spend, the worse they are. And that's a real sign of a culture that doesn't have anything going. If you're doing things on the cheap and it looks like a shanty town in Guatemala, okay, we understand. If when you've got money to spare, what you build is this inhuman kind of architectural equivalent of sticking your middle finger up at everyone who has to look at this thing when they pass by in the street, something is really wrong with you. Something is wrong with your socioeconomic system, but something is wrong with what has happened to you as a result of living in this socioeconomic system. Yeah.
So, and I'll close and then we'll open it up to questions. So for me, I see something very different when I go to Israel. In fact, one of the first things I and most people I know, be they Jewish or non-Jewish, coming away from Israel say, particularly when you move away from Tel Aviv, is what a beautiful country it is architecturally. For instance, there's a Northwest London synagogue, which just looks like it's a clone of an Israeli synagogue. There's a style to it. They've used golden bricks to replicate or mimic Jerusalem stone. There is an aesthetic which is Israeli, which does, and as a nation, we're 70 years old in terms of a state. And so we are finding our feet. And so the synagogue that you pulled up, the European shul, just looked like, truthfully, when I first saw it, I thought it was a church. It looks like one of the big choral reform synagogues. I don't know which one it was, but it looks very unorthodox and very Christian. And if you went to look at the shuls of the Middle East, they looked very different. They had a very different aesthetic, and it was much more in keeping with their neighbors. And what we tend to have architecturally, the architecture that Jews have, as we said before, reflects the societies that they lived in. And now that they've all returned to Israel, there's kind of a merging of those styles as we begin to find our own feet. And so it's really interesting. You did, I absolutely agree. The Gush Kativ Yeshiva it's an eyesore, that Magen David, that concrete. It's like, on that I think it's the one thing we agree on. That does hurt my eyes. I'd still say it's subjective. I'm sure some people look at it and think it's beautiful, but I'm not one of them.
It's not subjective. Again,
when it comes to Israel, when it comes to if you grow somewhere like Efrat's a great example. You probably look at Efrat and think, ugh, how tacky, how horrible, how everything is just, to quote one of your posts, rows of boxes. For me, I look at Efrat, it's beautiful. It's one of the most beautiful little towns. No, it's a city, but come on, it's not really a city. One of the most beautiful towns I've ever seen. It's and so this is my what I take issue with. Most of what you've said tonight is so subjective, and that same subjectivity can be applied to almost everything. You are making either a moral or a judgment in terms of its appearance and what that then represents on everything. And I just disagree with many of your conclusions. So what does the society do there? The best way is you let the market decide. And so if you're right and people prefer older buildings, they'll spend more money to live in those buildings, like the German colony.
Right, but the point is they already are, but they're not being built. Now, Efrat has some very nice parts. Again, all of the nice parts were built very, very soon after 1967, when there was an interesting kind of political opportunities. Go to the parts of Efrat they're building now, it's the same garbage. A bit less, because Efrat has some NIMBYism. And NIMBYism obviously is a dirty word, but NIMBYism is, in our current reality, is the only thing that stops, some places from going to complete hell. Your guys who come to Israel and they say how nice it is, where do they go? They go to Yaffo, they go to the Old City, they go to Mosheva Germanit, they go to the Bauhaus parts of Israel. That actually, designers can take credit for that, but again, pre-state. They go to, no one is going to anywhere built in the last 20 years and saying, wow, this is nice, guys. They're not. They get taken. Now, there are things, this is not Satan's country on earth, okay? Sorry, white nationalists, okay, I let you down. But this is, there are things they've done good. What the Zionists have done with the Old City, under the circumstances, the extension of the Mamilla Mall, was about as good as you can do. It's a bit consumerist, it's a bit tacky, but actually they've shown real respect, and they haven't just kind of stuck a whole bunch of filth on it. They've done a good job with the Kotel, they did a good job with the Chorva synagogue. Not every single little thing in this country is bad. But the system as a whole, what it does to its people as a whole, is a bad system. That's what I'm saying. And again, you guys on holiday, you're not coming to where the majority of people live, and certainly not where the majority of young people live. And we do not have an option to buy nice places, because none of them have been built in 40 years, and they have no intention of building anymore. So I can become a billionaire and I can live somewhere nice, or I can live somewhere horrible. But those are my only options.
So someone's asking, can they come on for 5 minutes? Would you object to me allowing someone on the stream? I've got no idea who they are, so it says we can mute them.
Do you get private messages?
Do we get private messages?
How does it work? Like they just go on the chat? Can I see all this as well?
So you can see if you go to the YouTube video, and there's a chat on the right-hand side, but just make sure you mute it so we don't get the feedback. And there's also a Facebook. So I'm going to actually post the link on both. But yeah, there's somebody just asked if they can get on. This usually goes terribly wrong when we do this, because it's usually like the worst of society wants to get on the channel. So ask Getty Clan. I think.
Can I have like a secret signal to get him off? If it goes bad.
I actually think he was on a chat. I was someone else's stream I was on the other day. I think from memory it's a Muslim. So Getty, I've given you the link. You can get on. This is not normal. Meanwhile, while we wait for Getty, I'll keep him in the lobby. And anyone else who wants to either ask a question or jump on the stream can. So actually, no, Getty's saying a good thing. So basically, I was on a stream. It's the person I'm speaking from, the neo-reactionary guy, was on that same stream, just for context. And there was a national Bolshevik, came on and called us lots of words and told us to get back in the oven. And I think Getty wants to come on and say that's, as a Muslim, he disagreed with everything they said, which is a good thing. So if that is your intention, Getty, thank you. Okay, questions. Fire away a question, people. So let me just, I saw a few coming through, so I'm just going to scroll up and see what we can find. There was lots of questions. But the chat's been going crazy, so it's just going to take me a while to find them. Tell you what, fire off your questions again. Okay, here's a good one. Can you see that on the screen? Why do you live in Israel?
Why do I live in Israel? Because it's obligatory for Jews to live in Israel. And this would be the case where we're under the British Mandate. It would be the case where we were under the Ottomans. It would be the case whether we were under the Persian Empire or the Greek Empire. And it will also be the case once we have a Jewish state. I think that that's probably a sufficient answer. I would encourage everyone who is Jewish listening to this, who is observant of Judaism, to move to Israel. The only thing I would say is, if you don't have a serious plan of how you're going to support yourself financially in this country, and you're going to get drawn into this Olim shadow economy, which is very bad for you and very bad for everyone around you, you should delay matters until you have a confident of a marketable skill. As the old joke goes, what's the best way to make a small fortune in Eretz Yisrael? Come with a large fortune. Now, Joseph, why don't you live in Israel?
So the intention is we were actually going to go house hunting, but Netanyahu's locked us out. Not Netanyahu, sorry, Bennett's locked us out for now, and so we couldn't get in. But they are opening up again. So as my friend Getty, who's going to jump on now, would say, inshallah. So let's bring Getty in. Hi, Getty. I called you my good friend. I've only spoke to you once, and I think we argued.
Joseph, respect to letting me on for just a few minutes, because I literally only got a few minutes before I have to go. But this thing that I have been hearing about, the disgrace and what these other people, the way they've been attacking the Jewish community, I have witnessed it myself on that day on that show, right? And as a Muslim, who has always been trying to support the Palestinian this and that, and had some biases towards the Jewish community, I do really understand this now. That it's not, it's just like a boiling pot, and these people are just building up. And I do understand, bro, like in a way we have to unite, because there could be our common enemies, because these people don't really understand, where the problem is, because they're just like, in a way, it's like they have got everything that we desire as human beings, right? Like when it comes to stability in the nations and all of that, but they're always complaining. They're still complaining. They don't understand our problems, your problem, my problem, but they're always in the one who's in, like, we need more. These people need to go, and all of these things, right? And one thing that, I want to take back, because last time what we spoke about was that the Israel becoming part of the African Union, and at the moment just a spectator, sitting in the back seat. But it's a special comment that Israeli made, said, we are trying to gain respect and honesty, So in a way, what you were speaking about that day as well was that Israel is trying to, gain the respect back and, the trust, basically. The most important was they want to try to get the trust back. And, as Africa is developing, right, and as Africa is more than 800 million Muslim living in Africa, half of Africa, people say that, but I believe it's more than that. Israel can play a big part in that, helping us build up, gaining the trust and respect, and gaining a big respect, amongst the Muslim community, because, like, we are the Muslim, we are divided, right? Like, it looks like over there, the Arabs are for Arabs, Africans for African, but we're supposed to just be one ummah, right? So I'm saying it's like, I think that could be great things for Israel, but Israel just needs to focus on the religion and, what the books tells them, trying to get away from the capitalism way of life, when it comes to the US and that, because they will drag you down. They are just like the Ethnonet. You have to understand, these people are godless people, in it. They have no religious, especially the Ethonets. And you building over there, they don't mind they just want to control both of us, As long as they can control both of us, they don't mind dragging us down, like they did in the past. So we need to be really careful about, we both our religions are putting God first, as it should be. And it's very important we put God first and not let anybody else come in between us. And today, to build this relationship, build this trust, between the Muslim and the Jewish community, right? As it was before, right? Before people got in between us, we never had this type of problem, bro. We never had.
So I'll just be completely candid and honest. So for those that don't know, I was on a Muslim stream the other day. Some ethno-nationalists, so white supremacists, let's call them what they are, and some national Bolsheviks who said he said he wasn't a Nazi, but then he went on to talk about like Holocaust denial, told us to get back in the gas chambers, hardcore anti-Semitism. And one of the things that many of the Muslims watching and actually taking part in the stream realized that actually Jews do face a very, very real danger, an existential threat for those of us that live outside of Israel. There are people that want to kill us, and they have done in every generation. And that's why we as the Jewish people one of the reasons we feel we need a state. Another is we believe we have a right to a state. And you touched on some other things, Getty. You mentioned that like Jews and Muslims had good relations, and we did. Under many caliphates, it was good for the Jews. Under other caliphates, it wasn't so good for the Jews. And so it just depended which one we were living under as to how good it was. Whereas for us, it's like, actually, if we're living under fellow Jews, then we're not subject to the whims of some tyrannical caliph or king or government, atheist government or religious government, where it's actually our destinies in our own hands. And that's why we feel, one of the reasons we feel we need a state. As for Africa, you probably don't know this, but in the early days of the state of Israel, Israel had a great relationship with Africa, and we went, and the Golda Meir really pioneered this, really investing huge amounts of money into helping Africans. Things with like agriculture and the things that we'd learned building this tiny state were then applied to African nations to try and help them with their own finding their own feet in this post-colonial world. And so that relationship was there in the past, and inshallah it should continue and go from strength to
Inshallah,
strength.
bro. And I do really pray. Is my mic gone by any chance? Can you guys hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you. Yeah.
Okay. And I do pray, forget about the Chinese, European, this and that. I really, really do hope that we do build this trust and Israel actually get the full contract of, building up the whole of Africa infrastructure and this and that, being part of the African Brotherhood, as we're not just a color, it's different nations, and yeah, so that's very important that we build this trust, and this trust doesn't get broken,
I agree.
between other people.
Really appreciate your words. I'm going to bring it back because we've got a guest on today, Gabrielle, and
That's
so
fine,
we can
mate. That's fine.
questions.
I just wanted to say the last thing. Yeah, I do realize that the financial, the big threat that you were speaking about. Yeah, it is like what's happened in the past, and people need to understand that, But like I was saying as well, like the Jewish Brotherhood should stop leaning towards that side, because it's a big net over there, right? And like they're all intertwined, over there. So
Yeah.
thank you, Joseph.
Jazakallahu. Okay, so we've now got Groyper, which is a nice take on Groyper. So those that don't know, Groypers are an anti-Semitic Nick Fuentes type online trolls. They usually live in their mum's basements. They don't wash that much. Most of them are incels. And so we've got Groyper saying, you call the white supremacist, but are you not a Jewish supremacist? And my answer is simply no. I believe that we're all created equal, all created in the image of God, which means we all have free will. I don't believe Jews are supreme or above non-Jews. I'll let Gabriel answer in his own words, but for me, I believe we're all equal.
Sorry, yes. I don't know. It's a bit of a broad question. I mean, I'm certainly a Jewish nationalist. In a sense, I guess I believe that Jews should be supreme in the Jewish state. I guess, and you could say that this was subjective. I think that on the whole, in a sense, everyone should be a supremacist. I think Hungarians should think they have the best culture in the world, and Yanomamo should think they have the best culture in the world. So that's kind of supremacy is good. I also think, the Torah kind of says that, the whole Jewish culture is like the only one that's not wrong on, the fundamental points of, who runs the world and stuff, i.e. God, not the banks this time. So in that sense, I'm a Jewish supremacist, and I believe Judaism is the right religion and other religions are wrong. And, I guess if Jewish supremacist means that I think that Gentile life is worthless, then yeah, I guess I'm not a Jewish supremacist in that sense. I hope that helps.
So you got another question. It's not really related to what we're saying, but what is it like having a child in Israel? Is it worth waiting before moving?
Okay, good question. You've got two stadim here. First of all, the schools are very, very poor, just by kind of any sort of, even if you take, Western capitalist standards of what a school's supposed to be, these schools are really, really, really bad. And on the other hand, of course, it's certainly true that you should. It's much easier to learn Hebrew. The earlier they come, the easier it's going to be for them to learn Hebrew. In my own personal case, I can say that had I known then what I know now about the effects that moving to Israel would have on it was then only one son we had when we moved, would have on him, I would have fought long and hard and had a much better plan about how to help him deal with the move. And so if you are thinking of moving to Israel, don't be mazelzel this topic. Think really, really hard about how your kid is going to fit in an Israeli school, an Israeli, what they call misgeret, which means system, but it's kind of a revealing term for people who know the etymology, and also how he's going to integrate with Israeli kids. It's a very serious question, but no, obviously not one I'm going to deal with in detail here, and I'm also not a parenting expert by any means.
So we've got another question from Zoltan Steiner, which is to Gabriel. Can you give us a short description of what Zionism exactly is? Also, what is Palestinian ethnicity in your understanding? Okay.
Zionism is what has been consensually referred to under the name Zionism for the last 120 years. If people call it a Zionist and people say they're Zionists, they're Zionists. And debates about who is a real Zionist and are really very fruitless, and they don't get you anywhere. Right now, Zionism actually, though, has a specific meaning. Zionism means you believe the state that exists right now is the legitimate ruling class of the Jewish people. You might want a more right-wing government, a more left-wing government. You might think, Shaked is going to sort out the Badats. Any day now, guys, any day now. But the point is, the current regime as a whole, of which all the political parties are part, you think it is legitimate and it has a right to rule over the Jewish people. And that is why I believe you should not, under any circumstances, identify as a Zionist. The second part, Palestinian, none of my business. Absolutely none of my business.
Okay, so we've got one request for you. So Goiber has said, Gabriel, can have an honest debate? I appreciate that. I feel Joseph hates white people and would never have an honest debate with me. So I think he's asked whether he's saying, is he asking you for a debate there, or is he just saying you have an honest debate?
What I will say, Goiper, I know how to read between the lines, and I'm very familiar with both Groiper and white nationalist and even white supremacist arguments. And it is not correct to say that Joseph hates white people. It is correct to say, with my apologies, Joseph, that Joseph, like the vast majority of Jews, has a long laundry list of unacknowledged hypocrisies about what he thinks is acceptable for Jewish people to do communally and what he thinks is acceptable for white people to do communally.
What's an example of one of those? Just you said there's a long laundry list and it's about me. So what's one of them?
Okay, the Jewish people can have a state. Can white people have a state?
There's European ethnic groups can have a state. Yeah, I wouldn't say white people. That's a weird thing to make because
can European ethnic groups have a state? Can European?
Slovaks do.
No. Wait a second. Wait. Okay, don't give me a hasbara. Let's go first of all. First of all, why can't whites have a state? Why not?
Because there is no homogenous culture that white people share.
So what?
The cultures are so divided. But okay,
so let's say if white people in a given area wanted a state, why can't it happen?
But that happens. That's what I'm saying happens. That's like Slovakia, which is defined as the state for the Slovak people. So,
okay, is it legitimate for Slovakia to have an immigration and demographic policy explicitly designed to maintain in perpetuity a Slovak majority?
If that's democratically elected by the people that live there, yes, that's down to the people who live there. Yeah.
Right, and any nation. So if Britain right now,
so as an example, Korea has a similar policy.
Okay,
China,
Britain,
most nations control
Britain right now, demographic policy specifically maintained to define a British majority. British means not you. You still have your rights, etc., but you don't count as British. British means, descended from people who lived in Britain 200 years ago. Let's say as a kind of rough thing. Okay, is that okay? Yes or no? Or is it racist?
So it's not, no. So how democracies work is they reflect the sentiment of the people that live there. And so if the British people voted in a party which had stricter immigration policies then that would reflect the will of the people. That's not the case for the UK, because the UK has been a liberal nation for many, many years, which is why they've housed many
Is it a good thing or a bad thing?
The Jews, to the 2 minutes, let me finish, to Bengalis. And so I'm not an ethno-nationalist. I don't like ethno-nationalism. I think a society that defines itself by its blood is a poor society. I think a rich society is one that defines itself by its culture. So the Jewish culture that we've been speaking about for 2 hours now, that is a good measure. So anybody can join the Jewish nation. It doesn't matter what your ethnic group is, whether you're black, white, African, Chinese, Indian, anyone can convert into and join the people, which is why Jews who live in China looked very different to Jews that lived in Poland, who looked very different to Jews who lived in India, who looked very different to Jews who lived in Yemen, because Jews have a history of accepting people from any walk of life, provided they accept upon them the culture of that people. So, if anything,
the culture of the people, you mean
Jewish people,
religion? You mean Torah and mitzvot?
I mean the religious culture of the people. Yeah, I would say religion is a culture. Yeah,
well,
and so if you convert into the Jewish people, first the people have to accept you, and if the people accept you, it doesn't matter what you believe. You can believe the exact same religious beliefs as a Jew. You can believe in the prophecy of Moses. You can follow the Bavli or the Yerushalmi to the best of your ability. You can believe all the words of the prophets. You can pray 3 times a day without a minyan or with a minyan. But if the Jewish people don't accept you, they reject your citizenship. As in the Beit Din, you're not Jewish. So being Jewish is 2 parts. So we're more like civ-nats. We're more like civic nationalists rather than ethno-nationalists.
Okay.
We're not.
Do you think civic nationalism? Do you think civ-nats? Do you think civ-nats in America are legitimate political actors? I agree, by the way, that we're more like civ-nats and ethno-nats, right? But do you think that American civ-nats, let's say the Proud Boys, are they okay? Yes or no?
So I don't know enough about the Proud Boys, but from what I've seen leaders of them coming out with horrendous things. So I'd rather speak about things I know rather than things I don't know.
Okay. Is British civ-nat fine? The British civ-nat British civ nationalism, is that fine? Yes or no?
Well, I say anybody that I would, yeah, but I would say it's far more acceptable.
So than to join the British people, you have to accept. To join the British people, you have to become an Anglican. Okay, you have to accept our traditional culture and folkways.
That's what happens. They even have a little test where you have to watch Coronation Street.
Okay. Obviously, the test. I mean, actually, you can't even pass the test if you have traditional British values as they were defined 50 years ago, because you have to kind of pledge allegiance to. But by the way, I work in kind of one of the things I do. I work in English education, and in some schools in London, which I won't say because they probably prefer me not mention their name. But one of the things that we have to do is that we have to make Monday. One of the things that is a legal requirement in Britain is the school has to teach British values. And if you look at British values and you say, did Churchill believe any of these things? Yeah, pretty sure he didn't. Did even Attlee believe these things? No, he didn't. British values means British values, and the test you have to pass to become a British citizen, circa 2021, is the values of the London metropolitan elite, who some of them do actually legitimately hate English working class white people. Many of them don't hate them; they just couldn't give 2 hoots about them, and they feel no particular connection with them whatsoever. But look, this is probably my answer to Goiper is I think Goiper probably sees in the conversation we just had for the last 10 minutes a confirmation of his views about the hypocritical and pilpalistic, which is I'm sure a word that Goiper knows, pilpalistic attitude of, wait, I'm talking, pilpalistic attitude of Jews towards other people's nationalisms versus their own, and their very, very easy ability to kind of make all sorts of distinctions that sort of sound good, but really actually don't sound good at all. And actually, but on the other hand, Goiper, you should know, Joseph Cohen, I'm almost 100% sure, and the vast majority of people who have these kind of blind spots do not actually hate white people, although it's true some people do.
So where's the you said I have it, I'm still waiting for it. So we went through. Look, I said it's okay,
and I know that if Britain or France or Italy or the United States modeled itself on the Israeli model of sort of semi-ethnic, semi-civic nationalism, had a demographic policy specifically designed to preserve the majority status of a group, you know that you would not support that. You would condemn that unreservedly. You wouldn't. You know that. This is just obvious. This is just obvious, Joseph. You know that a British You know that a British identitarian movement that excluded you would be, in your eyes, illegitimate. You know it, okay? And the same thing in Israel, of a national anthem which specifically has relevance to only Jews, a national flag which specifically has relevance to only Jews, okay? You know that these kind of now, what you're going to say because the British flag has a cross on it, okay?
Can I just jump? Because it's about me, so I just want to. So the UK has a large minority population. It has
large and growing, and you support the fact it's growing, yes or no? You think it should continue growing? Yes. No, you do. No. Would you ever vote for a party? Would you ever vote under any circumstances for a British party that wanted to cut immigration to zero, i.e., not decrease even by one person the number of ethnic minorities, but simply wanted to freeze it in place? Yes or no? You would unreservedly contend that as an extremist group. And such a person would not.
You're strong manning me.
Why is it strong?
Because I don't base my who I would vote for in British politics on their immigration policy. It would depend what their other policies were, the context in which that policy was set. So there'd be many, many different factors. It's not a case that I would never. In some circumstances I would, in other circumstances I wouldn't. But what I was trying to get to with my comment was Israel has around 20%, over 20% of its population are not Jewish today. Yeah.
Well, actually, far more, because it includes at least 500,000 Russian and other Eastern European immigrants who came as
not even of Jewish descent. So, in terms of many of them are not. Many of them, by the way, also not of Jewish descent. That's another issue, of kind of if we want to talk about Zionist malfeasance, is, officially Zionism is, and originally was supposed to be about bringing Jews back to the land of Israel, and they deliberately, knowingly, and determinately brought hundreds of thousands of non-Jews to Israel in order for their own ends. Anyway, but go on. I would never, ever support a policy of population transfer of that established minority community. Similarly, in the UK, there is a large minority community. I would never support the forced repatriation of those people that live in the UK. That is an extremist policy. That is an immoral policy. You have people who've lived here for for generations. You've had people who've lived in Israel for generations. And I think it is an immoral position to evict someone from their house because they are the wrong ethnicity for you. And I apply the same standard to the UK as I do to Israel. Similarly, when it comes to the immigration policies of Israel and the immigration policies of the UK, I think provided from my subjective position, they're not immoral policies. I think it's for the people to determine the quota of how many migrants are allowed into the country. I would make a distinction between migrants and people who are seeking asylum, genuine cases of asylum through persecution. I think states do have an obligation to look after those that come to them and need help when a state can support them. But you completely strawman me where you were saying and basically taking far right talking points and saying this is what Joe and all Jews agree, or Joseph and all Jews agree. They all think like this. They are all for ethno-nationalism for me, but not for thee, which is a solid far right talking point. And it's not.
What I would say is, if you take the average Jew in Britain, and you kind of give him an ethno-nationalism score for England and an ethno-nationalism score for Israel, in his views on, he'll come up about, and he would make a scale of 1 to 10. His views will be consistent in the sense that the lower his score for one, the lower his score for other. But his score for Israel will always be significantly above. So the average Israeli Jew is about a 6. On the kind of nationalism score, is how he views Israel. He's about a 6, and in England he's about a 2. That is what I would say. It's not that there's a kind of dual morality or something like that. It's that, you can kind of They also, I know these arguments. Israel's a small country, so it can't take as many immigrants as Britain. Israel's a country that was, Israel's a country. I'm just running through arguments that are very. You can go open the Jewish Chronicle right now or the Jewish News right now, and you can see these things. Israel's a small country, so it can't take in as many immigrants. Israel was a country that was founded as a specific refuge for Jews, and so it's different from Britain because Britain is like much wealthier. Britain, Israel is much poorer. It can't afford to take in as many immigrants. Israel has a crushing demographic threat, which Britain doesn't have. Blah blah blah. And all these, and all of them even have a certain element of truth to them. But what they add up to, and it's perfectly, there's nothing wrong with it per se, as long as you're just kind of a bit more open about it. And then when other people, some of them who are harmed by your policies, many people in Britain, working class, poorer people, are harmed by immigration. Some people benefit, but some people are harmed by it. Their wages go down. Their quality of life goes down because living in diverse neighborhoods decreases your quality of life. Some people observe this and they find it offensive, and you should do a bit more, as leftists like to say, do the work. You should do the work of understanding their perspective and how you appear through their eyes. And in the long term, you'll find it a lot easier to get on with the people around you if you do.
So a couple of points.
You should move to Israel, and you shouldn't be living in other people's countries in the first place. But
a couple of points.
In the meantime,
first, you made up a lot of numbers. Can we agree you made up those numbers just for the benefit? Because you're speaking to a platform that could go out to thousands of people, and you said that British Jews vote a 6 for ethno-nationalism in Israel and a 2 for ethno-nationalism.
I'll give you a very, very good example. French Jews, large amounts of French Jews have dual Israeli and French citizenship at the moment, therefore can vote in both elections. Okay.
And the leader of the far right there now.
There's nothing sinister about that. It's just a function of what happens. Now, at the last election, we know what happened. We know that French Jews overwhelmingly in this country vote Likud. We also know that French Jews, when they were given a straight choice between Marine Le Pen, who basically is a Likudnik, okay, and Macron, who is well to the left of any mainstream Israeli politician, they overwhelmingly voted for Macron. Why? Because in Israel, they identify as part of the majority, and in France, they identify as part of the minority. And to a certain extent, that's reasonable, but you should also understand how you're perceived by others, and not just kind of say, oh, you just want to build Auschwitz.
So Le Pen was representing Front National, which has a history. Her father was a hardcore anti-Semite. That may explain why many Jews were hesitant to vote for Le Pen.
And Likud's origins are what? What are the origins of the Likud?
2 minutes, let me finish. One of the leaders of the far right in France today is a Jew, and he's confusing a lot of white supremacists. Google it. I can't remember the chap's name, but he's leading the far right. Yeah, there we go.
He's called Eric Zemmour, and he's a cool guy.
And so the key thing I wanted to focus on here with all of this, though, is you speak it's almost that it's been the theme throughout this conversation. You speak definitively about things which are so subject. Everything that you presented, if I were to ask you to substantiate any of it, you couldn't. You would not be able to.
I'm sorry. I can substantiate that French Jews with dual Israeli citizenship.
In the UK,
mostly vote left in France.
Gabriel, 2 minutes. In the UK, the majority of the Jews voted for the Tories in the last election. Yeah, the Conservative Party, not the Left Party, which would have been the Labour Party. Yeah, before Corbyn, Jews were divided 50-50, and so your representation of Jews as the far right represent them as being on the left, as being progressive in everything, open borders, is not reflected.
No, I didn't say that. What I said is this. I said, as a rule, people's views on Israel and the country where they live track. So if they're more right-wing on Israel, they'll also be more right-wing in their country. If they're more left-wing on Israel, they'll be more left-wing in the country where they live. There are kind of these weirdo exceptions who are like super Zionist but super lefty. But okay, mostly that's how it works. But they're just a few notches over. The way they deal with Israel is just a few notches to the right. In fact, basically, it's almost impossible to find a British Jew who's not a couple of notches to the right on his position on Israel, as he is about his position on English politics.
I disagree.
I
disagree, and I would show you polls which would support what I'm saying. What are you basing that on?
Well, what I'm basing it on is as follows, which is Israel, by British standards, is an enormously right-wing country. Okay?
Yeah, and the British Jews think it's enormously right-wing. I don't know if you've been here recently, but British Jews as a whole, a two-state solution. Yeah, as an example, most Israelis, when polled, have lost faith in the two-state solution. So British Jews reflect the sentiment of the nation they live in, which is two-state solution. That's the policy. It's the Oslo mindset. Whereas Jews in Israel are post-Oslo. They've lost faith in Oslo. Same with Palestinians. Palestinians have lost faith in Islam.
Even supporting Oslo, that would put you to the right of English politics. Because, I'll give you an example. Herzog, the Labour leader until recently, okay, he said explicitly he supports a two-state solution. Why? Because he doesn't want to have an Arab prime minister. He used those exact words. He says, if we do not have a two-state solution, eventually Arabs will become the majority. We will lose our Jewish majority, and we'll have an Arab prime minister. Now, if someone said that in British politics, he would be BNP. Full stop. You couldn't say that in the Labour Party. You couldn't say that in the Conservative Party. This is just
missing context. You're missing context.
Joseph, you can Hasbara me. You can Hasbara yourself. But Goiper's listening to this, and he's just laughing his head off because it's so obvious to an outside observer how this works.
But Goiper is far right. The majority of British people are not far right. The majority of British people think like the majority of Jewish people here.
The majority of British people, when polled, time and time again, say they want significantly, drastically lower levels of immigration.
Yeah, I've also read Douglas Murray.
Now, why they can't have a political party? Now, it's an interesting. We haven't discussed about what democracy actually is. This is another thing you should discuss with your Reactionary chap in 2 days. Why is it that democracy consistently fails to represent majority viewpoints on such kind of basic questions of who's even going to be living in your country 50 years from now? Is an interesting question. But polls show consistently the vast majority of British people want drastic cuts to immigration, always have, and probably always will, whereas the majority of British Jews actually are either comfortable with levels, maybe cut it a bit, maybe cut it, maybe
which poll says that? Which poll says that of British Jews?
You know what? Find me a poll that says otherwise. I can show you what the Board of Deputies say. I can show you. Look, again, we can go through the Board of Deputies every single election produces a manifesto for British Jewry. And one of the things they say on this manifesto is, as Jews, and they use this language very carefully and very deliberately, as Jews, we want to ensure, blah, 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 that Britain will always be a refuge for migrants, anyone fleeing persecution from anyone in the world. Now, that is not the view of the Israeli state. It is not the view of any mainstream Israeli political party. It will never be the view of any mainstream Israeli political party. And the fact is, that is something that outside observers, most people aren't very politically aware, but people who actually like just paying a bit of attention, they see it and they say, look, guys, this is a bit, okay? Now, we can go on as this. We can go on like this.
It's a simple question. You made the claim that British Jews oppose the various immigration policies that you've cited. I'm asking you for evidence because I go on right-wing channels all the time and they say the exact same thing. So you've heard it, you live in the Jewish community and you're agreeing with them. And so I'm asking you, can you show me any poll which says that? Because I speak to lots of British Jews and they have varying positions when it comes to migration policy. So, for instance, there were Jews that stood with UKIP. There were Jews that were very for Brexit for immigration reasons. And so I'm not aware of a poll.
Well, by the way, that's a good example.
Jewish policy research or someone like that.
We do know how British Jews voted about Brexit. If memory serves, you can draw it up if you want. If memory serves, it was 66 for Remain and 34 for Leave. Okay, which is significantly different from the country which narrowly voted to leave. Now, Brexit was basically a proxy for, well, one, for immigration, and also in general for a kind of economic model which privileges people. Well, the famous example on Newsnight where that woman said, if we cut off all the immigrants, who's going to make my sandwich at Pret? Okay, that's the kind of extreme archetype of the Remain voter. Okay, and the extreme archetype of the Leave voter is, I'm unemployed because some guy from Pakistan took my building estate job. Okay, these are the kind of extremes, caricatures, if you will. Okay, we know that British Jews were significantly more Romani, despite the fact that they support the Conservatives. They're overwhelmingly concentrated in the kind of pro-European liberal wing of the Conservative Party. That is where the majority of British Jews find their home. And especially on issues like immigration, national identity, this is a position that is, in Israeli terms, super ultra duper far left, because Israel is still quite a nationalist country. And again, it's natural to feel this way. It's natural when you're living in a country to be like, "Oh, nationalism gives me the willies. I don't want to be left out." Okay, that's normal. It's not some sign of some deep psychosis or whatever. But you should reckon. And by the way, this is true of many different diaspora communities. Okay, Americans of Indian descent from India, the country India, right? They overwhelmingly vote Democrat, okay? But there's been studied that very large proportions, if they have those who have dual citizenship, vote for the BJP. Okay, it's very, very, very normal. This pattern replicates itself with every single community where there's a nationality, where there's a significant diaspora, where they are a minority, they take more liberal, more anti-nationalist positions, and where they are a majority, they take more nationalist positions. It's normal. It's even in a sense healthy, because just having kind of a survival instinct is quite a healthy thing to have. But just be aware of how other people see you, and so that because some of them will kind of twist it into you hate me and you want to genocide the white race. Or on mute. I can't hear a word.
Sorry, I said okay. So, and I try, as I said, I try to be as charitable as I can with people's positions, but I'm really struggling here to see this as anything other than your opinion. You haven't presented any evidence for any of the very strong claims that you've made, and you've said that anyone on the far right will agree with you, and I agree, they will agree with you. I grew up in a white working class community in the north of England. I didn't go to university. I didn't have the privileges of any of this. I'm probably more familiar with the communities you're speaking about than you are. I grew up in the northeast. I didn't grow up in the northwest London bubble.
Fine.
And
Nor did I. Okay.
You didn't either. Okay, so that's good. So we're sorry. Then that's an assumption on my part.
Okay. As it happens, I've never lived in northwest London. I lived in Stamford Hill for 6 years, but I never lived in northwest London.
Okay, so it's just Stamford. Okay, North London. But that's not where you grew up. I'm taking it then with the way you.
No, I grew up in Brighton.
Brighton. Okay, well, again, a very liberal middle class.
Yes, and I know well the mindset and attitudes.
Yeah, and so I'm saying that I come from a more working
to whom
class.
Jews overwhelmingly belong.
So, but I'm saying I come from a more working class background, and I'm telling you, as a rule, the British people don't necessarily align with the politics that you're aligning yourself with. And that's why the BNP, the National Front, any of the parties that could be described as ethno-nationalist or even white supremacist, none of them have even got the slightest scent of power, because they've been rejected every single time, because the British people, British culture, is incredibly liberal. As Hayek describes it, Hayek writes in The Road to Serfdom that if fascism were to ever take root in the UK, it would be a very liberal fascism. And he's right. It's a very liberal, a very welcoming nation, which is why my family were taken in as refugees. It's why your family would have been taken in as refugees.
Whoa. Wait a second. Okay. It was all, Britain has a long tradition of political and economic and certainly social liberalism. But, let's be real. Churchill wanted to run on an electoral program of keep Britain white. If he'd have done so, he probably would have won that election in a landslide. Again, the kind of strings that were pulled, American strings mostly, to disable that and install, the Macmillan government, etc. And so a long story about how Eden fell and who was money taps, etc., which is not for right now. But the idea that Britons have traditionally, to be honest, I'm not sure what this is relevant to what we're talking about, but the idea that Britons have traditionally been kind of racial liberals who want to invite the world is not true. It's an interesting, why it is the case that overwhelming public support for immigration restrictionism never translates into electoral victories is interesting. And when you understand the mechanisms in play, it's kind of hard to take democracy seriously as a political system. But that the idea that the immigration is a reflection of the will, these unprecedentedly high levels of immigration are not happening in Israel and will not happen in Israel, are a reflection of the will of the British people is not a sustainable view. And again, it's this kind of sort of, it's almost gaslighting that people like Goiper, they listen to this and it kind of drives them a bit mad. And some of these people really go mad. They get into cults. They start contemplating terrorism and stuff. I think that my personal recommendation to British Jews is, well, move to Israel, where you can at least, this element of your kind of split personality you can work on a bit. But in the meantime, just everyone is a hypocrite. Everyone has blind spots. If you don't know what your blind spots are, then if you don't know how you're hypocritical and you don't know what your blind spots are, I guarantee you there's big gaping ones that other people can see. That's all I'm saying. I don't think what I'm saying is extreme at all. I think what I'm saying is very, very moderate. And in a sense, once you're just open to be a bit more objective, it's just kind of obvious. Again, just try and imagine what a mainstream Likud or Shas politician, how they would be treated by the British media. Just do that thought experiment in your head. And then you see that there's a certain inconsistency in the attitude of British Jews to supporting Israel versus their general attitude to nationalism and especially ethno-nationalism in Britain.
So just before we close up, what do you think's happened with British immigration? When did it start getting to where it is? Because you're saying polls have shown and people have gone against the polls. Just talk us through what's happened. Because it's an area I know a little bit about.
Well, obviously the big increase in immigration levels happened quite early in the first Blair administration. Since then, I don't think that net migration has been under 500,000 now for going on 15 years. Now, by the way, net migration is a completely misleading term, a misleading concept, because net migration is the number of people coming in versus the number of people going out, minus the number of people going out. So if 800,000 come in and 300,000 leave, that's net migration of 500,000. But the vast majority of people who are leaving, who are coming in, almost all of them, in fact, are not of British descent, okay? Whereas large amounts of the people who are leaving are of British descent. So in fact, it would be more accurate if you're looking from a nationalist or a demographic perspective, not to subtract that figure, but to add that figure. So if 800,000 people come in and 300,000 people leave, it would be more accurate to say that the demographic change in your country is 1.2 million, 1.1 million, sorry. So that really got going with in the early years of the Blair government. And there was a rise, there were certain waves of immigration, like Jamaicans coming over to drive buses in the 50s and the 60s, more or less sort of put a stop to by the Enoch Powell movement, which didn't succeed in the sense he didn't become prime minister, but kind of scare politicians off for a number of decades into not kind of opening the floodgates, shall we say.
And so basically we can see here migration's basically steady. So way after Churchill until you write the Blair years. And then net migration peaks at just over 300 in 2014. This is old. I believe it's going high again this year. I can't remember the exact numbers. But this is a relatively modern phenomena. Yeah?
Yes.
The huge waves of migration. And we saw on the back of that, we saw Brexit. I agree. Migration was a big point for Brexit. One of the major assumptions, again, that you made when you spoke about Brexit was that Jews voted for Brexit. Sorry, voted to remain overwhelmingly because they were for immigration. That's not the case. You've got no way of being able to measure why Jews voted for.
It's a rough.
Yeah, I would imagine, like most people that were living in urban centres rather than in lesser so the major cities like London. London overwhelmingly voted to remain. The Jews in London reflected that. It could be as much for economic reasons as it could be for migration policies. And so what you do, you construct your argument by taking all these right-wing talking points that they throw at Jews, and you basically go, yeah, you're right, that's it. That's what Jews voted to remain because they want a relaxed immigration policy. You've got no way whatsoever of substantiating that, and it's an incredibly dangerous thing to tell a white nationalist that his anti-Semitic conspiracy theory is actually true.
Why? First of all, it's not a conspiracy theory. Saying people have blind spots and hypocritical, whatever
saying
it
that
is,
the Jewish community
it's not a conspiracy theory.
No, saying that the Jewish community vote for a relaxed immigration policy collectively.
It's not a conspiracy theory. It's not a conspiracy. Saying that British Jews are more pro-immigration.
I'll build on that and then go.
Average Brit. It's not a conspiracy theory. How is that? What does that even mean to say? What conspiracy? What are you even talking about?
Okay. If you say so, Nazis, ethno-Nats, white supremacists, they believe what you're saying. Yeah, they parrot the same talking points.
Well,
they say
I mean, this is not really true. Most white supremacists and Nazis believe in a theory by a professor called Kevin MacDonald, which is that Jews pursue a group evolutionary strategy, and nothing that I've said remotely hints or indicates such a theory. Other ones say, there's the kind of the whole, what's his name school? He wrote a book. It's all like, there's a kind of 2,000-year Talmudic plot to overthrow the Logos and whatever his name is. Yeah. Fine. But the point is, nothing of what I've said there is remotely what they said. If you want to find someone who's kind of similar to what I'm saying, then probably what I'm saying is fairly similar to what maybe Steve Saylor would say, who's a big civic nationalist in America, who, if he was in Israel, he'd just be a kind of mainstream member of the Likud. But because he lives in America, he's, considered far right. Again, I'm not alleging a conspiracy. I'm alleging something very, very natural, very, very normal, which is that when people are a minority, they tend to be more suspicious of nationalism than when they're a majority. And they'll be more suspicious of a nationalism that overtly and explicitly includes them, less suspicious, as does Israeli nationalism to Jews, than they would be to a nationalism which overtly excludes them to some degree, which any kind of serious British nationalism would, to some degree exclude Jews. Now, it could be kind of nice. You could say, no, you can be like Arabs are in Israel. You can be in parliament. Imagine someone in Britain, imagine a liberal, imagine even a conservative say, Britain's amazing. We have black people in parliament too. 20% of our no one shows off about that stuff because it's just kind of assumed. Again, it's only Zionists who have to come up with this weird argument. We're amazing because we have Arab parliamentarians. Of course we have Arab parliamentarians because we're in a country. What are you talking about?
We say that because we're called an apartheid and the neighbouring Palestinian Authority doesn't have one Jew in it. That's why we say that. Because we show the world what the reality is rather than what the charge is. But to bring it back to what you're saying, because I think it's really critical that it's very hard to lock you down on this, but just a very straight answer, not a long
I've said the same thing 3 times in a row. Jews have a certain blind spot towards other people's nationalism versus their own, as do most people.
My response to that is you have no evidence for that. It's just your opinion, yeah?
My evidence is, again, I was raised as an English Jew. I know many English Jews. It's what I've concluded from having observed these things over the course of my 34 years of my life. And I think it's what most people would conclude if they were really paying attention. You're lucky. Most people don't pay attention to this stuff. Most people don't really care. And it's not something that there's ever going to be a big Newsnight expose about anytime soon. Again, what I'm saying is, you say it's dangerous that I say these things. Personally, I think it's dangerous the other way. I think that there's really no danger in someone having there's really no danger in someone having Steve Saylor-esque views about Jews and just thinking, these Jews are a bit hypocritical and stuff. What is dangerous and literally costs people's lives is people going down a kind of radicalization rabbit hole. And what happened? Why do people go down a radicalization rabbit hole? It's because they think what this Goiper chat thinks, which is that these people hate me. They can't, any kind of reasonable explanation which just says that Jews are people like anywhere else, all people are hypocrites, Jews are also hypocrites, this is a specific way in which they're kind of a bit hypocritical. That you say, no, you're already a Nazi. The point is, by having this, you are already a Nazi. So what does someone who says you are already a Nazi, you're already excluded from polite society, you're already kind of a bank account, I don't know what. He says, his mind says, well, if I'm already a Nazi, well, there's only one group of people who will accept me, and that's the Nazis. And this is why you get people who lose their minds so much that they go and attack, get a gun and attack a shul or whatever. I do not think that just openly discussing these kind of issues is remotely dangerous. And if anything, I think the opposite is the case. In terms of violence and terrorism, you're much more likely. Now, the truth is, the establishment Jewish organizations like the Board of Deputies or the ADL couldn't care less about terrorism. They're never going to be a victim. In fact, their donations skyrocket every time there's an act of terrorism. What they care about is any kind of mass movement that might potentially emerge that would sort of in some way limit their ability to just sort of be hypocritical. Now you're probably going to say, even the ADL is not hypocritical. The ADL kind of being sort of radically far left on every American issue and specifically saying unlimited immigration is a Jewish issue. And then just saying, we oppose any kind of boycotts of the Jewish state, even though the Jewish state clearly, by your standards, is fascist. This is just this is just obvious stuff.
Gabriel,
and it doesn't do you any good.
For someone that grew up in the Jewish community, for somebody who is clearly visibly leading a Jewish life, you know very little about how Jewish society in the UK functions. And it seems to me that in terms of Jewish establishment in the UK functions, it seems to me that you've got your talking points from non-Jews, because anybody who has anything to do with the Board of Deputies would recognize instantly everything that you said about the Board of Deputies is absolutely nonsense. The Board of Deputies, how it functions, is there's a deputy is elected from various organizations, and you can have more than one deputy depending on the number of people within that organization. The deputies have different political views. There is a very clear left-right split within the Board of Deputies. What you tend to find is most...
Wait a second. And how does this left-right split manifest itself? I'll tell you exactly how it manifests itself. By the way, I know plenty of people who have been deputies, okay? I know some people who even are deputies, okay? It manifests itself very clear. When it comes down to writing their manifesto, the right-wing faction cares more about Israel than they do about Britain, and the left-wing faction cares more about Britain than they do about Israel. So the stuff about immigration gets written. I'll give you names if you want. Richard Verber, Phil Rosenberg. They get to write that section, okay? Whereas the stuff about Israel doesn't get written by them. It gets written by more right-wing members who care more about Israel. Now, that actually, in a sense, that actually excuses kind of Jews, because it means the hypocrisy is not so much kind of in the heart of each individual Jew, although I do think that is actually a real thing. It's more kind of a manifestation, just how these things kind of work out. I think that is actually to some extent true. I mean, something like the ADL, which is kind of so overtly and kind of ridiculously hypocritical about Israel and America, it's not so much that like they're scheming. It's just that you have kind of different factions, and one side gets their way on this thing, and one side gets their way on this thing. And factions tend to get their way on the thing that they care most about. People who are really into Zionism, probably American Zionists, like really hardcore ones, most of them are probably quite in favor of some degree of immigration restrictionism. They're probably a bit Trumpian. There's these neoconservatives who are kind of really hypocritical, but they're actually a small group. They punch above their weight because of the funding. But what they don't really care. They don't really care. Whereas the really hardcore lefties, okay, probably most of them actually have pretty hardcore lefty views about Israel as well. But, it's a different country. They don't really care so much. So when you get these pan-Jewish organizations, one side gets to speak about this and one side gets to speak about this. Again, and then this is not KMAC. This is not conspiracy. This is just understanding. And actually, I think, perhaps Goiper is slightly less, if he's still listening, is slightly less likely to one day, chas v'shalom, attack some Jew than if he hadn't heard these things. Because all he's going to hear from other people, like your dear self, is you are a Nazi, you are persona non grata in polite society. I'm going to do everything I can to help make you polite, drive you out of your, if I find out that you work in a university, I'll get you fired, like that chap in Bristol, the lefty. I'm gonna, I think my personal view, if you want it, is that by hearing these kind of more reasonable, real world, cynical, if you want, explanations, he's more likely to put these things in perspective and realize, Jews are one factor of what's going on. They're not running the world. They're not actually particularly influential in British politics. They're more influential in American politics. But again, they're not the whole story. And you don't get sucked into this echo chamber where the only people who are willing to talk about these issues are the ones who have the most outlandish and extreme explanations. That's what I think.
Okay, and again, I think the running theme for this conversation is...
it's not something I particularly care about, because I don't really care what Goyim think about me. I care about being a good Jew. I care about what being, living in the land of Israel is. I don't, Baruch Hashem, I don't have to kind of reckon with, these kind of inconsistencies. All I care about is being Jewish, being the best Jews we can, building the best Jewish country we can within the limits that are placed on us by the kind of global political order we live in. So this is not actually an issue that I think about particularly, but perhaps it's because I don't really care that I can just have a slightly more objective perspective on the matter.
But I would argue that everything that you've argued today is very hard for you to substantiate. So to take it back to the left-right divide in the amongst British Jews, you believe that it divides on Israel. If you're for Israel, then you're on the right. And if you're more pro-British or more sympathetic to British society than you are to Israeli society, then you're on the left.
No. That's not what I said. What I said is this. I said as very explicitly, if you have right-wing opinions, listen, because this is very clear. I said it like 5 times, and there's some kind of Haggadah module that's not allowing you to understand what I'm saying. But I'll just try again. As a rule, people who hold right-wing opinions about Israel, Jews who hold right-wing opinions about Israel, will also hold right-wing opinions about the country they live in, but a bit less. However, they tend to care more about Israel than their country. That's A. B, left-wing Jews will tend to hold left-wing Jews both about Israel and about their own country, but they'll be a bit more left-wing about their own country. And they'll also care about their own country more than they care about their left-wing issue in Israel. The combination of these two factors means at a macro level, there's a certain, not super extreme, there's a certain moderate degree of hypocrisy in the way the Jewish community as a lump reacts with regard to nationalism, if they're in America, Australia, it really doesn't matter, wherever they happen to be found, versus their views towards Israel. And again, the exact same pattern is found in, say, the Indian diaspora. I would be surprised if there was a single diaspora community anywhere in the world where this basic pattern didn't manifest itself to some degree. And it's not the end of the world. It doesn't mean you're the most evil people. It doesn't mean there's a 2,000-year Talmudic conspiracy to destroy the Logos. It just means that it's one of those things. It's a factor in British politics, not a particularly important one. But okay, so Goiper, to return to that thing, you should know Goiper, people like Joseph genuinely do not hate white people. Okay? Don't shoot up a synagogue, please.
And again, so I misrepresented what you said, but can you accept that you don't, other than anecdotal, you have no evidence to back up anything that you've just said?
Okay. If you want afterwards, there have been very, very extensive studies of the political attitudes of Jews in the United States. That is like, I can get on 5 minutes. If you want British stuff, I'll sit. If you really, really want, I'm happy to do my research. I'll get back to you in a week with my view that on average, British Jews take a slightly more nationalist attitude to Israel than they do to Britain. Something that, again, is actually really obvious to most people who think it's obvious even a priori. It'd be very surprising if it wasn't the case. And again, it's not, in itself, it's not the end of the world. The problem is denying that this is the case and basically creating a social reality where the only people who are willing to talk about these issues are super crazy racists. Which, by the way, is something you probably agree with yourself, because I think that you're one of these lefties who kind of recognizes that immigration has gone a bit too far. And I think that you probably agree that the fact that there's like this taboo that existed, that's been, that this taboo that's existed in mainstream politics about addressing the issue of mass migration is bad. Why? Because it gives oxygen to the far right, because they're the only ones willing to talk about these issues. And I'm just saying the same thing happens to be true about this much smaller and much more trivial issue which is that Jews are a bit inconsistent in their attitudes towards Jewish nationalism and other people's nationalism. That's all.
I think it's a good summary because you made assumptions on what my politics are without having a clue what they are.
There's certain things you said that indicated that.
Okay.
By the way, I'm giving you credit. I mean, maybe you're one of these lefties who actually thinks that immigration is the levels of immigration are A-OK, and maybe
even that I'm a lefty. Even that I'm a lefty.
Yeah, look, first of all, it says on your Wikipedia you're a lefty. Okay, I did a bit of research before I
have a Wikipedia.
You Google you. It says you're a left-leaning Zionist or something like that. Okay.
So I 100% was. I've been on a bit of a journey. Corbyn had a lot to do with that. I was raised on Marx and Engels. I do not sign up to communism or socialism anymore. But I was raised, so historically that would have been true, but it isn't today.
You identify as right-wing, right-centre?
No, I don't like the left-right binary at all. I think it's a terrible descriptor. But I wouldn't describe myself as left-wing, and I wouldn't describe myself as right-wing.
Okay. Would you say that you agree with the statement that the taboo in mainstream politics on addressing concerns about mass migration has the unpleasant side effect of boosting the far right? Not just in Britain, but in many countries. Yes or no?
Say it again. I just want to make sure.
Taboo in mainstream centre-right or centre-left politics about discussing the negative consequences of mass migration has the bad side effect of promoting the far right because they're the only ones visibly willing to talk about it.
Yeah, I think I agree with that statement.
Good. And I think exactly the same thing is true on a much tinier scale with this issue of Jews are a bit hypocritical. I think that the fact that there's an enormous taboo on talking about it and people who talk about it at all, again, people who don't even really care, actually, because again, I live in Israel and I think you should be living in Israel. And I think we shouldn't really even talk about this. We should be talking about, wait a second, what's the roadmap to Beis HaMikdash? Okay. But since we are talking about it, I think that the fact that these kind of, no one is willing to talk about it except Nazis. And again, most of the people who are willing to talk about it are Nazis. It's true. And they start off reasonable. And then, you get into it for 5 minutes and they're like, oh, you're a Nazi. That in itself is a bad thing. And one of its bad consequences is that young men in their early 20s who are having difficulties with their life, who are open to kind of looking for a scapegoat and they're looking for the most plausible thing possible. There is a very determined internet industry of people saying, every problem in your life, every problem in your family's life, your community's life, and your country's life is because of Jews. And the way that they work is that they start off with forbidden nuggets of truth that no one else is willing to say. You hook them on that, you get them already labeled a Nazi, and then it's very easy to just start saying, oh, by the way, there's a group evolutionary strategy, and like Jews are propelled by their genes to undermine the white race in all its eternality. And this is a very, very destructive thing. First of all, it manifests itself in acts of violence. Second of all, there are I don't care that much, but there are numerous not especially intelligent young white men whose lives are irrevocably ruined by being radicalized in this way. And it's just a bad thing. And it would, one of the small improvements we can make to the world is kind of cutting off this radicalization pipeline. My personal opinion is that there are many people who understand how this works, and they're either fine with it or they're actively amplifying it because they know every single time a Nazi goes to a synagogue and does a swastika, ADL's donations go poof. That's my view.
Okay, so I disagree with that last part, but what I just add is you mentioned that it's complete taboo. No one's talking about it. Trump was elected on immigration. Brexit came about because politicians were talking about immigration. So it's definitely a conversation that's happening within Western society. You find yourself on one side of the divide, but it's definitely a conversation that is taking place, and politicians are being elected on the back of it.
Okay, I don't think you quite right. Okay, you're not receptive to what I'm trying to say. That's fine. Mostly, I thought this was a very enjoyable conversation, and I'm only saying that I have to go because it's literally
1 o'clock or something. Yeah,
it's literally midnight over here in Israel, where you should be, and every Jewish person who is from, I say that advisedly, should also be. And that's
So
my
on that
parting
we
message.
agree. So closing comments. Is there anything you'd like to close with? People are asking where they can find you.
You can't.
Israel.
No, my website, Haggadah Berurah. There you go.
It's on the YouTube. We've put it's in the description on the YouTube channel. If anyone wants to find the Haggadah, do you want to give a very quick description of what it is?
No. If you go on YouTube, there's a whole hour shir that I gave on it, which I think does the job amply.
Amazing. All right. Thank you very much, Gabriel, for your time. Thanks for everyone for watching. If you would like to find Gabriel, head over to HaggadahBerurah.com.
Yes.
Yeah. Which is in the YouTube link. And if you'd like to support the Israel advocacy movement, you can do so via Patreon, or you can follow us on any of our social media. Gabriel, I'm going to take us offline. We can speak afterwards for 2 seconds.
Peace in the Middle East.